Welcome back, brother Sam Ulmer. Tonight's story, we have some Mortarion on Tyberos action, but before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment in videos or topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it like always. Now, let's get into the video.
The system died by degrees, and every degree had a voice. On Asphodel Secundus, the first sign had been the sea. It had once been iron grey, poisoned by industry and holy runoff, yet still obedient to tide and moon. Now it heaved green and black beneath a skin of fungal scum. Waves rolled against the hive piers, thick as rendered fat, carrying drowned things that knocked against the adamantium pilings with the soft insistence of begging hands. Fish rose belly first, in continent-wide slicks. Then the fish opened their clouded eyes and began to bite. By the second day of the visible contagion, the oceans were vomiting. By the third, the hives followed. Hive Drusus burned from crown to sump, but fire did not cleanse it. The Prometheum storms only drew colour from the plague and gave it breath. Smoke climbed from the spires in swollen ropes, green at the core and black at the edges, churning upward into a sky that had forgotten the Emperor's light. Manufactoria split open along their pressure seams. Cathedral stacks belched infected ash over hab districts packed with kneeling citizens. The faithful choked mid-prayer, clutched at Aquila pendants with fingers that had already begun to rot, and died with hymns leaking through liquefied throats. The Vox networks did not fail at once. That was the mercy denied them. For hours, every channel carried the system's death. By the throne, the dead are moving. Medici stations are overrun, requesting purge teams, requesting flame, requesting anything. My son is at the door. He is dead. He is speaking with another voice. Governor's palace has sealed itself. The crowd outside is infected. The crowd is still singing. Emperor, preserve us. Then the signals thickened. Words became wet clicking. Choirs became coughing. Astropaths clawed out their own eyes and smeared plague sigils across the inner walls of their sanctums before their handlers shot them. In orbit, Imperial monitoring stations recorded casualty projections until the numbers ceased being useful. The adepts replaced them with the only designation that remained honest: total contamination. The dead rose in their billions. They came from trench ossuaries, hab-block mortuaries, Medici overflow pits, corpse starch intake yards, plague wagons, family shrines, battlefield charnel mounds, and the burning foundations of cathedrals. They came poorly at first, with broken knees and dangling jaws, dragging themselves through ash on snapped fingers. Then the song found them. A pressure gathered beneath the skin of the world, low and indulgent, like laughter heard through grave soil. The corpses stood straighter, ruptured lungs inflated, dead mouths opened. A billion throats gave thanks to a god the Imperium named only in warding and hatred. Beyond the inner world, void war had already been lost. The plague ships had passed like patient leviathans, their hulls swollen with centuries of rot, their prows crusted with corpse matter, their launch bays drooling with clouds of flies. They did not hurry. They did not need to. Their torpedoes had ruptured in the upper atmosphere as seed pods. Their boarding craft had struck the outer defense stations as diseased nails driven into bone. Men of the Imperial Navy had fought in pressure suits slick with vomit and blood, firing shotguns down passageways full of their former comrades. Ratings had welded hatchways shut, while knuckles hammered from the other side, and voices promised reunion. Officers had ordered magazine detonations, with tears blistering down their faces, and their ships had died in white fire, only for green lights to kindle in the wreckage hours later. The system's final loyal signal was not a plea. It was a confession. This is Watch Captain Halbrecht of the orbital bastion St. Casimir. We have failed. The contagion is within the ammunition stores and the chapel vaults. The dead wear our uniforms. The shipyards are singing. We have initiated self-destruction, but the engines answer to another will. In the Emperor's name, do not send rescue, send judgment. Then the bastion's vox dissolved into flies. The Inquisitorial conclave met in a chamber without windows, aboard a black ship that had not yet crossed the Mandeville Point. Its walls were warded with silver wire, hexagrammic scripture, and the bones of saints too minor to be named outside their reliquaries. Servitors moved without sound, their mouths sewn shut, their eye lenses dimmed beneath wax seals. A null stood beside the inner door, pale and hairless, his presence turning every thought in the chamber cold. Inquisitor Malrek Voss watched the last picked captures of Asphodel Secundus with the expression of a man studying a wound before ordering amputation. He was old, though age in the Inquisition was a matter of damage rather than years. His left eye had been replaced by a brass augmetic that clicked as it focused. His right hand was flesh, gloved in black. His left was steel, resting upon the table beside a rosette, darkened by smoke and old blood. Around him sat savants, savant corpses wired upright for memory extraction, magi biologists in sealed helms, an ordo malleus exorcist with a throat full of iron staples, and 3 naval lords who had already been told they would not leave the chamber if their courage failed before their usefulness did. The hololith above the table turned slowly. It showed infection blooms, orbital plague vectors, warp residue, demon signature residues, gene-coded rot patterns, and the shape of a crown formed from 7 interlocking barbs. A magos biologist spoke first. His voice emerged through a grill wet with static. The strain is not local. It is not the product of a minor vector cult. The rot carries layered warp instruction, gene alchemical, mimetic, necromantic, and empiric. It does not merely kill. It teaches the dead obedience. "Death guard," said one of the naval lords. The exorcist laughed once, without mirth. "Death guard is an inadequate word for this." Voss did not look away from the hololith. "Continue." The magos raised a finger of polished bone and brass. The crown sigil widened. Around it shimmered ghost images of mist-clad mountains, pale fortresses, corpse fields, and a sky the color of bruised milk. The plague bears resonance with Barbaran atmospheric toxins, not historical samples alone, active metaphysical inheritance. It is attempting environmental conversion, atmospheric pressure alteration, toxic reproduction, mortuary reanimation, soil corruption, spiritual despair induction. "Speak plainly," said the oldest admiral. The magos turned his sealed face toward him. "It is making worlds remember Barbaros." At that, no one spoke. Even the stitched-mouth servitors seemed to pause. The name carried weight beyond cartography. Barbaros, death world of poison clouds and corpse lords. Barbaros, the cradle of Mortarion. Barbaros, dead in history, yet alive in hatred wherever the Pale King walked. It was not merely a place. It was a wound in the memory of mankind. Voss touched a rune. The hololith changed again. The crown became clearer. It was not ornament. It was formula. A plague encoded into matter, sound, blood, and faith. Something intended to be manufactured, distributed, worshipped, and unleashed. "The Barbaran crown," Voss said. The exorcist bowed his head. "A weapon." "A sacrament," corrected the magos. "A contagion liturgy. If completed, it will permit plague hosts to remake conquered environments at strategic scale. Lesser echoes of Barbaros, breeding grounds for the death guard, pilgrimage worlds for the plague god, recruitment fields for the dead." One of the admirals made the sign of the Aquila. His hands shook. "We must send everything. Battle fleet reserves, guard crusade elements, titans if they can be mustered. Petition the nearest chapters." "No," said Voss. The word fell softly. It ended the thought. The admiral stared at him. "Inquisitor, with respect, an entire system has been murdered." "With respect," Voss answered, and there was none in the words. "An entire system has been converted into ammunition." He gestured to the hololith. Pox hosts swarmed across a collapsed boulevard, a river of bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, their mouths open in joyless praise. Lasfire cut lanes through them. The lanes filled again before the guns could cool. The Astra Militarum will provide numbers. Numbers will become infection stock. Every regiment deployed without absolute isolation protocols will die and rise. Every field hospital will become a shrine to rot. Every commissar's execution pit will stand up and march against him. He turned to the naval lords. The navy will suffer boarding. Plague hulks will contaminate decks. Ratings will spread panic before they spread disease. Macro batteries do not cleanse. What survives inside the blood? Then to the exorcist. Conventional Adeptus Astartes intervention risks failure before surface deployment. Honorable assault patterns will be anticipated. Glorious spearheads will become plague trophies. Reinforcement becomes exposure. Exposure becomes corruption. Corruption becomes defeat. The chamber listened. Voss let the silence breathe. We do not require deliverers. We require predators. The null beside the door shivered. Not from fear, perhaps, but because some older ward in the chamber had begun to wake. Voss placed his steel hand upon the table. The surface opened with a sigh of old mechanisms. Beneath it lay a reliquary box of black iron, chained shut and marked with seals so ancient the wax had darkened to the color of dried liver. 3 inquisitorial sigils were stamped upon it. 2 had been scratched away. One of the savants began to weep blood. "Inquisitor," whispered the exorcist, "that protocol was buried. Not deeply enough. That debt is not called lightly. No debt worth calling ever is." The black iron box opened. Inside was a sliver of void black stone, a strip of flayed parchment, and a tooth too large to be human. The parchment bore a title written in a hand that seemed cut rather than inked. Tithe right. Voss lifted the tooth. The astropathic choir was already dead by the time the message was sent. Their bodies sat enthroned in copper cradles below the conclave chamber, skulls open, brains wired into a resonance engine fed by sanctified pain. The choir had been executed 3 days earlier to prevent warp contamination. Their souls, trapped in the last convulsion before departure, still screamed when stimulated. Voss gave the command. The dead choir sang. The message did not travel like a plea. It traveled like blood in black water. It passed beyond imperial shipping lanes, beyond charted patrol routes, beyond the familiar corridors of sanctioned crusade fleets. It went into the outer dark, into regions where maps became warnings and warnings became prayer. It carried no promise of glory. It carried debt. It carried tithe right. It carried an ancient oath spoken before men now worshipped as dust. It called the Carcharodons Astra. No answer came. For 9 shipboard days, the black ship fled the dying system under silent running. Behind it, Asphodel Secundus burned green. The other worlds followed. Asphodel Primus sealed its polar hives and was betrayed by its own corpse furnaces. Pelagos turned its oceans against its cities. The agri-moon Belisar produced a harvest of swollen bodies hanging from its grain towers like fruit. The shrine moon of St. Orpheon rang its bells until the bell ropes became intestines and the pilgrims tore one another apart to better hear the music beneath their skin. On the 10th day, the Auspex officers aboard the black ship began reporting absences. Not contacts, absences. Regions of space where radiation faded, where machine spirits lowered their voices, where augur ghosts vanished, as though something vast had passed between the stars and refused to be seen. The first vessel emerged without translation flare. It was simply there. A grey strike cruiser, scarred from prow to engine spine, its hull plated in the colour of dead ocean stone. No proud heraldry burned from its flanks. No triumphal hymn preceded it. Its running lights were dim, its drives cold, its weapon ports sealed like the eyes of a waiting predator. Then another came, then another. Escorts slid from the void in a spreading formation, cold and silent, their armor marked by tooth, exile, and old war. Their machine spirits did not announce themselves with Binharic pomp. Their Vox identifiers arrived as brief bursts of static, each one carrying designation, tonnage, and permission to approach, nothing more. The Carcharodons had come without banners. They had come without assurance. They had come like judgment that did not care whether it was witnessed. Voss received them in the Black Ship's strategium. He dismissed the naval lords. He dismissed the savants who were still alive. He kept only the exorcist, the null, and the hololith of the dying system. The doors opened. The first Carcharodon entered in silence, power armor grey as deep sea stone, helm marked with black eye lenses and ritual scarring. Then came another, and another, each massive, each still. They did not look around. They did not kneel. They formed a kill line without being ordered, as if the chamber had always been a battlefield, and they had merely arrived at their assigned place within it. Then Tyberos entered. The chamber diminished around him. His warplate was Terminator armor, but altered beyond standard pattern, enlarged and brutalized until it seemed less forged than excavated from the bones of some abyssal god. Cables lay across it like tendons. The ceramite was scarred by wars. No archive in the chamber possessed clearance to name. Upon his fists rested the relics Hunger and Slake, chain-bladed lightning claws of monstrous size, their teeth still, yet somehow eager. He carried the scent of cold void and old slaughter. Voss had stood before chapter masters, demon hosts, cardinal tyrants, and an Eldar prince whose name had killed 3 translators. Tyberos made no sound, and Voss felt the older fear, not panic, not awe, the recognition of a killing thing. The red wake halted before the hololith. His helm turned slightly. For several breaths, there was only the soft clicking of the Inquisitor's augmetic eye and the distant hum of the void shields. When Tyberos spoke, his voice was low enough that every mortal leaned closer to hear it. "You called." Voss inclined his head. "By debt, tithe right, and ancient oath. Accepted. No ceremony, no challenge, no demand for justification." The exorcist's jaw tightened. The null stared at the floor. Voss touched the hololith. The Barbaran crown appeared above the table, rotating in diseased light. "This is not a war of compliance, Shade Lord. This is a surgical strike into damnation." Tyberos looked at the sigil. The claws of Hunger and Slake flexed once, a minute movement that made the exorcist flinch despite himself. "Then we shall cut deep." The words were soft. They carried no fire. That made them worse. Voss gave him everything: plague vectors, orbital casualty maps, astropathic residue, surviving pict feeds, defense projections, the suspected origin within Mortarion's realm, the likelihood that the Barbaran crown was being gestated behind warded fortress layers connected to the Death Guard's disease manufactoria and the Black Manse itself. At the name Mortarion, one of the Carcharodons shifted his weight. No more than that. Tyberos did not move. "The Death Lord guards his own work," Voss said. "If he manifests, no asset short of a Primarch should engage him directly." Noted. "You understand what that means?" Tyberos turned his helm toward him. "It means the objective is not his death." Voss studied the black lenses. "And if he stands between you and the objective, then he will be delayed." The Inquisitor found no arrogance in the answer. That disturbed him more than pride would have. Tyberos did not speak as though he believed himself Mortarion's equal. He spoke as though equality had no relevance to the act of cutting. The plan formed with inhuman speed and no mercy. The Carcharodons would not launch a crusade banner into the eye and roar their defiance. They would not attempt symbolic liberation. They would not preserve infected populations for later interrogation. They would not spend strength holding ground that plague could reclaim. They would bleed the outer defenses first, not with honor companies, but with condemned bodies, unmanned hulks, false retreats, and orbital feints. They would map the plague responses by watching what the Death Guard chose to rot first. They would draw fire from mountain batteries and orbital docks. They would sacrifice expendable forces to reveal toxin flows, demon engine layers, artillery pits, and warded approaches. Then, when the fortress world opened its diseased mouth, they would strike into the throat. Red Brethren Terminators through teleportarium insertion. Devourer cadres through low atmosphere assault. Dreadnought talons where walls required breaking. Scout elements where Auspec's sight failed. Serfs, bondsmen, and tithed mortals where death needed counting. No rescue priority for compromised assets. No delay for wounded who could not be sealed. No quarantine breach tolerated. Voss listened and understood that he had not summoned saviors. He had summoned a blade with no hilt. When the final tactical projection ended, Tyberos gave his first order. All survivors in the Asphodel system are to be sterilized. The exorcist looked up, sharply. There are sealed shelters still transmitting loyal codes. Then they will die loyal. Voss said nothing. Tyberos continued. No biological material leaves the system. No pilgrim, no governor, no child, no corpse, no relic, no ration stock, no water, no ash. Burn the worlds, crack the stations, scour the void lanes, record all transmissions for intelligence extraction, then silence them. The order passed into the fleet. It was obeyed. From the observation bay of the Black Ship, Voss watched judgment descend. Carcharodon vessels moved through the infected system with glacial discipline. Lance fire stitched white lines across hive crowns. Cyclonic charges were not spent, for the world still had tactical use as containment pyres, but orbital bombardment turned cities into burning wounds visible from space. Plasma warheads fell into refugee masses gathered around sealed landing fields. Prometheum storms rolled through Hab districts, where men, women, and children had painted Aquilas on rooftops in the hope that loyal eyes would spare them. They did not scream for long, not because the fire was merciful, but because it was thorough. On Pelagos, the green oceans ignited where chemical slicks met lance heat. Steam columns rose into the upper atmosphere, carrying the cooked remains of continents of plankton, fish, sailors, dock workers, corpses, and things that had stopped being any of those. On Belisar, the agri-moon's grain belts became rings of flame. On St. Orpheon, the shrine bells melted in their towers and poured bronze over the pilgrims still clawing at the cathedral doors. Carcharodon's serfs recorded it all, not as tragedy, as expenditure, population remnants, burned, orbital assets, denied, plague stock, reduced, transmission relics, archived, contamination risk, acceptable. Voss stood beside Tyberos as the system became a furnace. He expected to feel hatred for the giant beside him. Instead, he felt something colder. Agreement. That was the true horror of the Imperium. Not that monsters existed beyond its walls, but that sometimes only monsters kept the walls standing. A final Vox signal broke through the jamming for 3 seconds. A child's voice, perhaps, or a thing using one. Please. Tyberos did not turn. The lance battery fired again. When there was nothing left in the system but burning clouds, broken stations, and worlds smothered beneath their own funeral smoke, the Carcharodon fleet changed course. Toward the Eye. The translation rites were performed without splendor. No choir of praise, no sermons of victory. Chaplains walked the embarkation decks, not blessing warriors for survival, but reminding them of the proper shape of death. Armor was sealed with black wax. Chain blades were oiled. Bolters were loaded with sanctified mass reactive rounds. Teleport homers were tested under silence protocols. Apothecaries sharpened gene seed blades and checked the killing charges built into their own narthetium gauntlets. Tyberos stood upon the command dais of his flagship as the warp opened ahead. It did not bloom. It festered. The stars bent backward. Reality split like infected skin. Beyond the wound lay color without mercy, voices without throats, and the long road into the domain of gods that hated mankind more intimately than any Xenos ever could. "Translation imminent," said a serf, his voice trembling despite the iron pins through his cheeks. Tyberos gave no speech. The Carcharodons required none. The fleet entered the wound. Far away, where disease had architecture and despair had gravity, the black manse brooded beneath a sky of corpse vapor and demon wings. Its towers rose from the plague planet like the bones of a dead giant forced through rotten flesh. Bells tolled within it, though no hand pulled their ropes. Laboratories breathed beneath the mountains. Gardens of swollen bodies hung in chains, blooming with sacred rot. Mortarion stood among them. The pale king turned his masked face toward the void. He felt the intrusion not as alarm, but as irritation first, then curiosity. A cold fleet, a silent hunger, a procession of grey predators moving through poisoned immensity with no hymn but purpose. Not sons of Gilliman, not bright fools in heraldic pride, not crusaders drunk on impossible hope, but butchers. Mortarion's wings shifted, shedding grave dust and flies. Silence rested in his grip. The lantern glimmered at his side. Around him, plague adepts bowed until their faces split against the floor. Beneath his rebreather, the Death Lord spoke softly. "The void has sent me another corpse to educate." And in the dark between damnation and duty, the Carcharodons came on. The warp corridor did not open before the Carcharodons. It rotted. Reality peeled back in layers of diseased light, and the fleet passed into a wound that had been used too often by things that should never have possessed ships, souls, or names. The Geller fields burned pale around the hulls, their machine spirits chanting in Binharic misery as empiric pressure pressed against them like a sea of fevered mouths. Beyond the wards, there was no true void, only a tunnel of suppurating color, corpse green and bruise purple, and the yellow-white of exposed fat. Derelicts drifted within it. Some were imperial, or had once been. Pilgrim ships hung broken amid the warp tides, their stained glass chapels cracked, their devotional pennants fused to hull plates by centuries of filth. Shrine barges turned slowly, their processional bells still tolling, though no air carried the sound. Corpse ships moved among them, their cargo holds swollen open, spilling bodies that did not scatter into the warp, but gathered in long, obscene chains, hand-gripping ankle, jaw-biting wrist, dead eyes turned toward the passing grey fleet. There were plague hulks, too, great, bloated things. Their hulls had become landscapes of rust, fungal towers, exposed decks, and tumorous armor. Lanterns burned in ruptured gunports, chains dragged from their flanks for kilometers, each link crusted with frozen blood and devotional rot. Some bore the markings of the 14th Legion beneath layers of corruption. Some bore no markings at all, for their names had long ago been eaten. The Carcharodon ships did not answer the dead. They moved through the corridor in silence, drives guttered low, vox discipline absolute. Their vessels passed through shoals of astropathic ghosts that broke against the Geller fields like pale birds against glass. Faces appeared in the shimmer for heartbeats at a time. Men with burned eyes, priests with mouths sewn full of plague flies, naval officers still wearing their caps, still mouthing commands issued in battles lost before living memory. They screamed through the walls without sound. They begged, they warned, they accused. No warrior aboard the Nikkor turned his head. In the Strategium, Tyberos stood before the primary hololithic sphere, as if carved into the command dais. His armor was locked to the deck by mag clamps, not for stability, but because even the ship's ancient spirit seemed to prefer knowing exactly where he stood. Around him, mortal serfs worked their stations with iron pins through their cheeks and wax seals across their brows. Carcharodon officers waited in silence, helm lenses turned toward the tactical projections blooming in cold light. The warp corridor narrowed ahead. The auspex did not show an ambush. It showed sickness. A distortion moved in the Empyrean like a clot passing through a vein. Then another. Then 7 more. At first they appeared as shadows behind the skin of reality. Then their prows emerged through the green. Death Guard plague ships slid into the corridor, vast and obscene, their hulls swollen like drowned corpses pulled from a warm sea. They came with shields raised, engines coughing warp flame, and clouds of demonic flies boiling around them in impossible numbers. The flies were the size of attack craft. Their wings beat against the Geller fields and void shields, not with physical force alone, but with hatred given anatomy. Mandibles scraped across energy barriers, proboscises stabbed into shield harmonics. Where they struck, the protective glow of the Carcharodon fleet shivered and discolored, as if bruised. A mortal auger serf vomited into his rebreather and kept working. "Enemy vessels on intersect course," he rasped. "Plague signatures confirmed. Macro batteries hot. Torpedo tubes open." Tyberos did not speak at once. The Death Guard ships advanced with patient inevitability. Their prows were crowned with rusted iron and plague bells. Their broadside decks opened like infected mouths, revealing macro cannon barrels wet with green condensation. They did not accelerate for a glorious charge. They did not maneuver for elegance. They simply filled the corridor, bringing mass, filth, and time with them. The first plague torpedoes launched without fanfare. They came slowly by naval standards, fat and armored, each one trailing vapor like the breath of a fever victim. Carcharodon point defense opened in perfect silence. Flak bursts filled the warp corridor with brief white flowers. Lance fire cut through the diseased gloom. Some torpedoes died, erupting in clouds of yellow mist that screamed as they dispersed. Others reached the outer void shields. They burst against the barriers and did not vanish. Viral fog clung to the energy planes, crawling along them like mold across glass. Shield harmonics fluctuated. Warning runes bled red across command decks throughout the fleet. Where shields had already been scarred by the demonic flies, the plague mist seeped through in microscopic threads, riding damage, static, prayer failure, and mechanical fatigue. On the destroyer, Blackfin, Deck 9 died first. The fog entered through a shield relay vent, no wider than a man's finger. It moved with purpose. Ratings at their stations began coughing blood so dark it looked black in the lumen strips. Their teeth loosened. Their tongues swelled. One man tried to call for medici aid and vomited a rope of intestinal tissue into his own hands. The deck officer ordered masks sealed, then fell as his spine softened and folded under the weight of his torso. Servitors continued loading the macro cannon. They walked through the vapor, flesh sloughing from the metal of their limbs, dead eyes fixed on red loading runes. Shells moved from hoist to breech. Piston arms rose and fell. A gun crew collapsed around them, drowning in their own lungs, fingers clawing at throats that had become sacks of fluid. The macro cannon fired again, shaking a chamber carpeted with twitching bodies. The distress rune appeared on the Nikor's hololith. Tyberos looked at it. "Seal Deck 9, he said. A serf swallowed hard. "Lord Reaper, there are still loyal ratings alive below the bulkhead line." "Seal Deck 9. The order passed. Blast doors fell through screaming men. One crushed a gunner across the waist and pinned him half in, half out, his upper body beating at the inner side while his legs kicked uselessly in the infected mist. The inner locks turned. Warning shrines flared. Purge nozzles descended. The surviving crew behind the doors began to pound, not for rescue, but because the plague had found the marrow of their bones and was teaching them to move after fear. Tyberos watched the rune shift from amber to black. "Continue fire." The Carcharodon fleet answered the ambush as predators answer noise in deep water. They vanished from expectation. Destroyers cut their engines and coasted cold through the turbulent warp wake of larger ships. Frigates shuttered their emissions and slipped beneath corpse ship debris, letting the dead hulls mask their signatures. Torpedoes launched from tubes that had not announced activation, their machine spirits muzzled beneath silence protocols. Boarding claws fired from blind angles. Assault boats drifted powerless until enemy augers looked elsewhere, then ignited at knifing range and punched toward plague hulls like hooked teeth. There was no battle hymn, no challenge, no honor duel between captains across the void. One Death Guard cruiser turned to bring its broadsides to bear, and 3 Carcharodon torpedoes entered through a rent beneath its prow, detonating within the lower gun decks. The plague ship convulsed, its belly split open, spilling infected ammunition, burning serfs, and chains of chanting corpses into the corridor. Another enemy vessel found itself bracketed by lance fire from vessels that had been absent from its auspex moments before. Its port shield collapsed, and boarding claws struck the exposed flank with brutal precision. Still, the Death Guard endured. Their ships took wounds that would have killed loyal vessels and continued forward. Fires burned green along their decks. Ammunition chambers ruptured, only for diseased flesh and demon iron to seal around the breaches. Plague bells tolled through the corridor, and with each toll, dead crewmen aboard damaged Carcharodon vessels twitched harder against the straps and seals that held them down. Then the escort charnel tide was breached. The first indication was not a warning rune. It was a sound. A wet impact rolled through the ship, followed by the shriek of tortured adamantium. Boarding craft had struck. Amidships, their drills chewing through armor plating and inner sanctums. Corruption poured in with them. The breached chapel's wall burst inward in a storm of rust, smoke, and human teeth. Blightlord Terminators emerged from the wound. They were massive, even by the measure of the Adeptus Astartes, encased in corrupted Terminator plate, swollen with growths, trophy bells, cracked icons, and tubes leaking pus into the deck grating. Their armor bore the green and bone of the Death Guard beneath centuries of filth. Horns rose from helms. Lenses glowed with fever light. One carried a plague combi bolter fused into the meat of his gauntlet. Another dragged a flail, whose heads were skulls still biting the air. A third held a bubotic axe, its blade wet with toxins that hissed where they dripped onto steel. They fired as they advanced. Plague bolts detonated among the ship's mortal crew, turning men into bursts of infected matter. A serf's head came apart against a reliquary bulkhead, spraying brain, teeth, and black phlegm across a painted shark maw. Another was struck in the chest and split open as if something inside him had kicked outward. The Death Guard did not hurry. They stepped through the gore with the patience of undertakers, come for what was owed. Carcharodons countercharged from the side corridors. Grey armored warriors moved without war cries, chain blades already snarling. The first assault brother hit a Blightlord at the waist, his chains ward screaming against corrupted plate, teeth spitting sparks and green ichor. The Death Guard Terminator looked down almost curiously, then fired his combi bolter point blank. The Carcharodon's torso burst open, ceramite plates blown outward, organs reduced to red mist across the corridor wall. A thunderhammer struck the Blightlord's helm a heartbeat later. The impact caved in horn, faceplate, and skull beneath. Rotten matter sprayed from the crushed helmet. The Death Guard warrior staggered, but did not fall. He swung his flail and caught the hammer-bearer across the shoulder. The blow tore through ceramite, bone, and secondary heart alike, ripping the loyalist apart in a wet diagonal ruin. More Carcharodons came. Thunderhammers rose and fell. Chain blades bit. Power fists cracked open swollen plate. The corridor became a slaughter tunnel of hammer blows, playgrounds, shorn limbs, and bodies too transhuman to die cleanly. A Carcharodon lost both legs to a scything axe and kept dragging himself forward, firing his bolt pistol into a Death Guard knee joint until his head was stamped flat beneath a rusted boot. A Blightlord had his belly opened by twin chain blades, spilling loops of black intestine and nests of flies, and only laughed as he crushed the attackers against the wall with his bulk. The charnel tide requested reinforcement. Tyberos denied the request. Then he issued another. Red Brethren, recover the machine core, scuttle the vessel. The teleportarium of the Nicor answered in crimson light. The Red Brethren arrived in the heart of the charnel tide, not as rescuers, but as executioners. Their Terminator armor was marked in old red, dark as clotted blood over grey. Lightning claws and chain fists activated in the same moment their boots struck the infected deck. They did not secure survivors. They did not call for evacuation corridors. They went toward the machine shrine. A group of mortal voidsmen saw them and staggered from a side chamber, hands raised, faces blistered, but still human. "Lords," one croaked, "we are untainted. We can still serve." The Red Brethren passed through them. Lightning claws opened the men from throat to groin. Chain fists reduced the twitching bodies to pieces too small to rise with purpose. One voidsman remained alive for 3 seconds, crawling through his own spilled organs and whispering thanks because he understood the mercy too late. At the machine shrine, the ship's core screamed in Binharic anguish. Its casing had been pierced by plague growth. Wet cables pulsed around sacred brass. Cherubim servitors hung dead from the ceiling, their wings molted, their skulls gnawed hollow from within. A Blightlord champion stood before the core, one gauntlet pressed to the altar, as if baptizing the machine spirit in rot. The Red Brethren attacked. The champion turned with a laugh that vibrated through the deck. His weapon was a great plague blade, notched and heavy, the edge shining with alchemical filth. He killed the first Red Brother by splitting him from collar to pelvis, but the Terminator did not fall until his chain fist had bitten halfway through the champion's shoulder. Another Red Brother drove lightning claws into the Death Guard warrior's back, cutting through armor, ribs, and swollen lung sacs. The champion twisted, vomiting black bile across the attacker's helm, and the lenses melted inward. Still, they pressed him. They did not need victory to be clean. They needed the core. A tech marine in red-marked plate strode into the shrine behind them, servo arms clicking. He ignored the battle, clamped extraction talons into the machine spirit housing, and began cutting free the memory reliquary while his brothers died around him. Plague rounds struck his armor. One servo arm was severed. A fragment of infected blade punched through his side and stayed there, pulsing. He continued the rite. "Core fragment sanctified," he voxed. "Withdraw," came the answer. "Contamination extreme. Withdraw what is needed." The Red Brethren left with the machine spirit core and nothing else. Behind them, melter charges bloomed through the charnel tide's spine. The escort broke open in the warp corridor, its final reactor screams swallowed by green fire. Exposed decks vented crew, plague warriors, corpses and ammunition into unreality. Some bodies burned, some froze. Some continued fighting until the flames took their arms away. Tyberos watched the icon vanish. No word of mourning passed his vox. Ahead, the largest plague hulk in the enemy formation turned ponderously, presenting a flank like a continent of rust. Its name appeared in corrupted signal burst, translated by unwilling cogitators as the Blessed Gangrene. It was older than some imperial subsectors. Its hull carried cathedrals of rot, macro cannon towers, corpse gardens, and launch bays clogged with flies. It had swallowed the fire of 2 strike cruisers and continued to advance. Tyberos gave a new order. "Prepare assault locks." The bridge grew colder. His honor guard moved with him, but the Red Wake was first into the boarding torpedo. The craft's interior was built for Terminator mass, all restraint clamps and black iron. Serfs sealed him in with hands that trembled despite years of conditioning. Hunger and Slake rested open at his sides. Their chain teeth woke one by one, clicking softly, like animals scenting blood. The boarding torpedo fired. It crossed the gap through flak, plague mist, and swarms of demonic insects. A fly struck the torpedo's prow, and burst across it, leaving acid and screaming faces smeared over the armor glass. Another was shredded by defensive bolters. The torpedo did not slow. It hit the plague hulk beneath a gun deck and drove through outer armor, inner plating, bone growth, and a membrane of living rust before locking its breech teeth. The doors opened. Tyberos entered the blessed gangrene. The air was thick enough to chew. It rolled against his armor in brown-green clouds, filled with spores, ash, and the powdered remains of saints stolen from 1,000 reliquaries. The corridor beyond the breach had once been imperial pattern, perhaps. Now it was lined with meat. Pipes emerged from walls like veins. Chains hung with bodies in various stages of devotional decay. Some still lived. Some thanked him for coming. Some begged him to join the garden. Tyberos walked forward. A plague marine fired from the left, his bolter roaring. Rounds struck Tyberos's plate and detonated, chewing scars into ancient ceramite. Hunger took the warrior's arm at the elbow. Slake entered beneath the helm. Tyberos pulled both weapons apart, and the Death Guard's head and chest separated in a burst of rotten meat and blackened bone. Another came with a plague knife. Tyberos caught him by the throat, drove him into the wall, and held him there while Hunger's chain teeth opened the warrior's torso, layer by layer. Armor, fat, muscle, diseased organs, things nesting where organs should have been. He let the pieces fall separately. He did not hurry. His honor guard followed, clearing side passages with storm bolters and chain fists. The plague hulk answered with more defenders. Plague marines emerged from vapor, firing from behind corpse barricades. Possessed crewmen crawled across ceilings, limbs bent backward, mouths distended around clusters of flies, servo skulls trailing. Entrails shrieked catechisms to Grandfather Nurgle until Carcharodon bolters burst them apart. Tyberos moved through it all with the steady inevitability of a processing engine. He did not rage. He did not posture. He killed. Every movement was economical. A step to avoid a blade, a turn to shear through a knee, a downward punch to cave in a helm. Hunger and Slake chewed through corrupted bulkheads when doors sealed before him. They tore through plague growth. They removed limbs, heads, weapon arms, and torsos with the same dispassionate rhythm. He was not a berserker. He was a slaughterhouse given legs. In the Hulk's central artery, a Death Guard champion waited beneath a canopy of hanging corpses. He wore Terminator plate bloated with pipes and bells, his helm crowned by 3 rusted horns. A cluster of Nurglings capered at his feet, smearing filth across the deck. His right arm ended in a chain fist, crusted with dried marrow. His left held a combi bolter, whose barrel drooled green fire. "You come so quietly," the champion said. His voice was wet stone dragged over graves. "Little shark, little loyal corpse." Tyberos advanced. The champion fired. Bolts struck the red wake in the chest, shoulder, helm. Detonations rocked him. Plague acid smoked from the impact craters. Tyberos kept walking. The champion laughed. "You cannot frighten what cannot die." Tyberos reached him. "I did not come to frighten you." Hunger and Slake struck together. The champion met him with the chain fist, and the impact shook the corridor. Sparks and diseased ichor sprayed across the hanging dead. Tyberos took the force, shifted, and drove one claw into the Death Guard warrior's elbow joint. Chain teeth screamed. The arm came away in a gush of black fluid and shredded cabling. The champion headbutted him. A horn broke against Tyberos's helm. The Death Guard warrior laughed again, even as Slake punched through his abdomen and tore sideways, spilling ropes of intestine, swollen organs, and squirming white grubs across the deck. He kept laughing until Tyberos seized his helm with both claws. For a moment, the two giants stood almost still. Then Tyberos pulled. The champion came apart. Armor plates split. Bone cracked like snapped timber. Rotten lungs burst under pressure. The helm tore free with half the spine attached, and the body below it remained standing for several seconds, arms twitching, entrails slapping wetly against its thighs. Tyberos threw the head into the deck filth and stepped over the remains before they finished falling. The blessed gangrene died by internal wound. Carcharodon melter teams cut into its plasma regulators. Chain fists opened ammunition sanctums. Boarding parties placed charges in void shield shrines and engine confessionals. The plague hulk tried to heal itself around the damage, demon flesh knitting across adamantium fractures, but the Carcharodons kept cutting until the vessel could not close fast enough. Tyberos withdrew only when the kill was certain. Behind him, the plague hulk's midsection ruptured. For one vast moment it seemed to inhale. Then its spine blew outward in a storm of flame, rust, bodies, and shrieking flies. The explosion lit the warp corridor like a diseased dawn. The outer plague fleet broke formation. Not in fear. Never that. The Death Guard did not flee as mortal navies fled. They yielded space because time remained on their side, because every wound they had inflicted would fester, because every corpse in every sealed deck might yet become useful, because the plague planet waited ahead, and no invader escaped that world unchanged. The Carcharodon fleet pressed through the wreckage. Damaged ships bled atmosphere and fire. Some compartments remained sealed and hammering from within. Servitors scraped infected flesh from loading rails. Apothecaries moved through quarantine holds, extracting gene seed from warriors whose armor had been opened by plague blades. Those too compromised were granted bolt shells through the helm. Those still useful were resealed and returned to duty. Tyberos stood again upon the command dais of the Nicor. His armor was scored, pitted, and stained with rot that hissed beneath purification oils. Surf scrubbed the deck where pieces of Death Guard matter had fallen from his claws. None touched hunger or slake. The warp corridor began to widen. Ahead, the green murk thinned. The stars returned first, wrong and distant, arranged around a wound in reality that made mortal eyes water blood. Then came the orbital debris fields. Then the chained docks, vast rusting structures anchored to nothing sane, their mooring lines stretching into cloud banks and fortress moons. Defense platforms drifted in layers, each one armed with macro cannons, lance batteries, plague missile silos, and bells large enough to bury cathedrals beneath their sound. Beyond them hung the world, the plague planet. It was swollen and hideous, wrapped in toxic cloud bands that moved like the breath of a sleeping beast. Continents bulged beneath veils of green and yellow storm. Mountains pierced the atmosphere like rotten teeth. Rivers of filth glimmered where lightning exposed them. Around the equator, orbital fortresses and corpse docks formed a broken crown of iron. Below, through gaps in the clouds, mountain batteries turned their barrels skyward, waiting. The serfs of the Strategium lowered their eyes. The Carcharodons did not. Tyberos looked upon Mortarion's fortress world, and his voice passed through the command vox as softly as a blade entering flesh. The penal transports had followed the Carcharodon fleet like chained carrion. They were ugly vessels, imperial in origin and damned in purpose, slab-sided hulls layered with prison decks, punishment shrines, shock gates, and execution galleries. Their names were not spoken aboard the Nicor. They were inventory marks, not ships. Each carried men the Imperium had already spent in judgment, but not yet collected in death. Murderers, mutineers, failed crusaders, oathbreakers, debtors whose bloodlines had been sold into service, penal legionaries with explosive collars locked beneath their jaws, hive scum dragged from gallows yards, condemned soldiers taken from broken regiments before the firing squads could finish their work. Some were already sick, not fully lost, not poxwalkers, not yet corpses with orders. They coughed behind quarantine glass, their eyes yellowing, their veins darkening beneath skin tattooed with prison brands and devotional scars. Medici servitors marked them with red wax. Tech adepts fitted them with sealed helms that would not open again. Chaplains observed them without pity. they were still able to carry a weapon. They were still able to walk. Therefore, they were still useful. The red tithe was called before planetfall. No bell rang. No sermon softened it. The order passed through the prison hulks in a sequence of iron chimes, shock maul strikes, and vox commands delivered in the flat voices of Carcharodon's serfs. All condemned assets were to be armed. All condemned assets were to be deployed. No condemned asset was assigned extraction. The men heard it in holding decks lit by red lumen strips. They stood shoulder to shoulder in stink, sweat, fear, and chemical fog, while armory servitors trundled between them with racks of laser guns, shotguns, stubbers, autoguns, grenades, flame units, and crude blades stamped with the aquila. Some laughed when the order came, because men who have lived too long beneath sentence sometimes mistake finality for freedom. Some prayed, some spat. Some battered themselves against the shock bars until voltage cooked the skin from their palms. One old murderer with a face covered in gang script asked a passing Carcharodon serf where they were being sent. The serf did not answer. A space marine did. He stood at the end of the deck in grey plate, towering over the condemned, helm lenses black and empty. His name was Akuru, a line warrior newly raised into the strike elements assigned to Tyberos's command echelon. The men did not know his name. They knew only mass, silence, and the shark tooth markings cut into his armor. "You will land in the lowlands," Akuru said through his vox grill. "You will advance until death prevents further movement. You will fire upon all hostile forms. You will mark plague concentrations by dying within them. You will reveal artillery positions by drawing their fire. You will expose hidden paths by vanishing upon them." A penal trooper barked a laugh. "That is it? We just walk into hell for you?" Akuru looked at him. "Yes." The laughter died. Another man raised his manacled hands. His beard was stiff with dried vomit. "And if we live, you will not." There was no cruelty in the words as mortals understood cruelty. There was no pleasure. That made them heavier. Condemned had heard officers lie before. They had heard commissars promise redemption. They had heard priests declare that the emperor's gaze would warm them in death. This giant gave them nothing, no absolution, no honor, no lie sweet enough to carry into the mud. A chaplain of the Carcharodons walked among the cages afterward, Crozius held low, skull helm turned from man to man. His armor bore strips of parchment blackened by the smoke of forgotten crusades. His voice entered every cell through the Vox network, low and grinding. "Your lives were forfeit before this hour. Now they are measured. Each breath remaining to you belongs to the void, the chapter, and the throne. Spend it forward." No blessing followed. The transports opened their bellies above the plague planet. The lowlands rose beneath them through a mantle of corpse fog. It was not land as loyal men understood land. It was a vast diseased basin stretching between mountains whose peaks were hidden in green storm. Swamps steamed beneath the clouds. Rivers crawled in looping wounds through black peat and pale fungus. Rust forests swayed without wind, their trunks made of dead iron and their leaves like strips of flayed skin. Far away, immense structures loomed and vanished behind the vapor, fortress silhouettes and plague stacks and towers from which bells tolled with the patience of burial. The first landing craft descended in waves. They shook apart before they reached the ground. Plague flak blossomed from hidden batteries, not in clean bursts, but in obscene flowers of shrapnel, spores, and burning pus. Dropships tumbled through the fog with wings sheared away, trailing men from broken harnesses. One penal lander struck the swamp at an angle and ruptured, spilling bodies, fuel, ammunition, and screaming prisoners into boiling mud. The survivors crawled out burning. Things beneath the surface took them by the ankles and pulled. Other craft made it down. Ramps slammed into mire. The condemned battalions emerged into poison. They wore mismatched rebreathers, pressure capes, flak scraps, prison fatigues reinforced with cheap ablative plates and collars that blinked red beneath their helmets. Their weapons were stamped with fresh purity seals that peeled away in the acid fog. Commissarial overseer skulls floated above some formations, barking pre-recorded threats from dead officers. Servo skulls clicked picked capture lenses. Carcharodon Auspex drones moved higher, hidden in the cloud layers, counting, measuring, watching. The first orders came. Advance. The men advanced. The Death Guard let them. For the first few hundred meters, nothing fired. The only sound was the sucking pull of the mud and the ragged breath of men walking toward a horizon that hated them. Some fired into the fog anyway. Last beams flashed green and died. Stubber rounds cracked into fungal trunks. One man screamed that he saw his dead brother walking beside him. Another beat him quiet with a rifle butt until both men were dragged under by hands rising from the slime. Then the lowlands opened. Poxwalkers rose by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands, then in numbers that made counting an insult to the dead. They emerged from the swamp as if the mud itself had grown teeth, fingers, and hunger. Bloated heads broke the surface. White eyes rolled. Mouths opened in ecstatic groans. Bodies sloughed free of the mire, wearing the remains of guard uniforms, pilgrim robes, naval void suits, plague cult rags, and nothing at all. Some were fresh enough that their faces still held terror. Some were ancient, their bones showing through skins of moss and rot. All moved toward the living. The condemned opened fire. For a moment, humanity's oldest answer to horror worked. Laser snapped, autoguns rattled, grenades burst among the dead, throwing limbs and skull fragments into the fog. Flamers washed promethium across the front ranks, turning poxwalkers into stumbling torches. Men shouted, men cursed, men laughed in terror as bodies fell. Then the fallen stood again, or those behind them climbed over the burning piles. The 1st Battalion vanished beneath the press. Men were bitten through masks. Hands punched through flak armor and pulled ribs open. A penal trooper emptied his laser gun into a corpse with half a head, then beat it with the hot barrel until another poxwalker chewed through his throat seal. Green fluid sprayed into his helmet. He screamed once, choked, and began laughing while his eyes clouded over. His collar detonated when his vital signs failed, taking his head and the 3 dead things eating him. The explosion marked a toxin current. High above, aboard the Nicor, a Carcharodon Auspex officer entered the data. Tyberos watched the hololith without moving. The invasion map was not drawn in terrain first. It was drawn in human extinction. Every penal formation glowed as a cluster of dull runes. As they died, the runes changed color. Red for projectile contact, amber for chemical kill, black for immediate necrotic reanimation, white for demonic manifestation, blue for artillery impact. The lowlands became a ledger of screams. Eastern mass collapsed, said an Auspex serf. Reanimation interval short, less than 1 minute by local measure. Mark heavy contagion, said the Carcharodon officer. Southern column under indirect fire, munition type plague mortar. Impact spread suggests concealed artillery pit beneath fungal canopy. Mark battery. Central assault wave halted. No visual contact. Audio capture indicates drowning. Map ground instability. Below, the fog swallowed men in whole companies. A trench line appeared where no trench had been a breath before. Its edges were slick with yellow slime. Men tumbled in, vanishing to the chest, then the neck, then the crown, dragged down into fluid thick with bones and leeches. Those who tried to pull them free lost hands to things beneath the surface. One prisoner sergeant ordered his squad to anchor ropes around a rusted stump. The stump unfolded, revealing itself as a plague growth full of mouths, and ate the rope team from the waist upward. Still the order repeated, advance. The condemned advanced because explosive collars taught obedience more quickly than faith. Then the cultists came. They poured from the rust forests and corpse hamlets in fevered masses, howling hymns to the grandfather with voices cracked by rot. They were men, or had been, swollen with blessings they wore proudly as medals. Some had antlers of bone growing through their skulls. Some had bellies split open to display pulsing organs painted with devotional filth. Some dragged chains of loyalist skulls. Others carried corpse banners stitched from the skins of imperial soldiers, the aquila inverted, the faces left attached and stretched into expressions of eternal surprise. They came with heavy stubbers, grenade launchers, rusted autoguns, plague knives, and flamers whose tanks sloshed with liquid disease. Behind them waddled plague spewer teams in rubberized robes, their masks shaped like grinning beasts. When they fired, streams of alchemical corruption washed over the penal lines. Men did not simply burn. They bloated, split, and burst. Armor sagged from liquefying bodies. A whole platoon turned to red and green vapor in seconds, their bones clattering down like dropped tools. The cultists laughed as they killed. The condemned answered with terror made violent. They charged because standing still was death, and retreat meant detonation. Shotguns roared at close range. Chainswords issued from penal armories bit into diseased flesh. Men stabbed plague cultists in the gut, and found hands gripping their wrists from inside the wounds. A death thrall smashed a cultist's head open with a rock, and was sprayed with black brain matter that crawled across his faceplate and found the filter seam. He dropped his weapon, clawed at his own eyes, and began singing. The Death Guard entered behind the horde. They came as a line of inevitability. Plague Marines strode through the fog in corroded power armor, ancient ceramite the color of bruised green and dirty bone. Horns and rusted vents rose from their helms. Flies crawled across their pauldrons. Their boots sank deep into the mire and withdrew with soft, wet sounds. They fired plague bolters with patient accuracy, mass reactive shells bursting among the condemned and filling the air with fragments of armor, blood, and infectious matter. Blight launchers thumped from the haze. Grenades landed in crowded groups and erupted into clouds that made men claw out their own throats. A penal commander tried to rally his line around a fallen Aquila standard. A plague bolt struck his chest. He opened from sternum to spine, and the standard disappeared beneath the spray of his lungs. Another officer, not yet dead, still transmitted. "We are pinned. We are pinned. Requesting armored support. Requesting extraction. By the throne, we are surrounded." On the Nikor, the transmission played across a minor channel. No one answered. Akuru stood near the command dais, watching the casualty runes multiply. He had killed in boarding actions, in tunnel wars, in void raids where the enemy froze before their blood could fall. He had seen men die by the thousands. Yet below him the lowlands consumed millions, as though feeding a furnace. The condemned were not failing. They were fulfilling purpose. That was what made the slaughter feel less like battle and more like mechanism. He turned his helm slightly toward Tyberos. "Lord Reaper." Tyberos did not look away from the hololith. "Speak." There are formations still coherent in the Western Basin. Some retain armory integrity. They could be withdrawn and redeployed. A long silence followed. Akuru felt the attention of the command deck settle upon him. Not judgment, not yet. Merely recognition that a younger warrior had asked whether meat already thrown into the abyss should be pulled back before the abyss finished chewing. Tyberos answered without turning. Extraction was never assigned to them. Akuru bowed his head. Understood. At the edge of the strategium, the chaplain who had walked the prison decks raised his Crozius and spoke into a closed command channel shared only by the strike officers. Every dead mortal purchases a meter of ground. Every infected body marks a plague vector. Every scream carries range, density, and response time. The Emperor wastes nothing. The Void wastes nothing. We shall not dishonor their expenditure with hesitation. Below, the Western Basin died. The penal soldiers had reached firmer ground. a ridge of black stone overlooking a valley filled with fog. For 6 minutes they believed they had broken through. They cheered through ragged throats. They raised weapons. They sent coordinates. Then the valley floor opened, and demon engines crawled out. Fetid shapes dragged themselves from buried warrens, their iron hides slick with mucus and rust, their gun barrels twitching like animal limbs. Some were small and insectile, bloat drones rising on whining turbines with plague spewers hanging beneath them like swollen glands. Others were squat and armored, crawling on treads and clawed supports, their launchers coughing shells into the penal ridge. Men vanished in blossoms of filth and metal. A drone swept low, its sprayers hissing, and a line of prisoners dissolved from the outside inward, skeletons standing for a breath inside falling coats of flesh. The Auspex officers marked the warrens. Further north, artillery revealed itself. Plague-burst mortars fired from pits concealed beneath mats of fungal growth. Their shells arced high, slow and bloated, then descended among battalions attempting to cross a corpse canal. Each impact became a crater of green flame and bone shrapnel. Men died in clusters so dense that the hololith briefly lost individual tracking. Their icons merged into a single dark stain. The Auspex officers marked the artillery pits. In the central basin, a route appeared only because so many men died trying to cross it. The condemned had been funneled by swamp, cultist fire, and poxwalker pressure toward a wall of cliffs half hidden by fog. There, beneath hanging chains and waterfalls of sewage, massive lift structures groaned against the mountain face. They were industrial elevators, each platform large enough to raise battalions, siege engines, or plague harvests toward the fortress levels above. Cables as thick as hab towers disappeared into cloud. Around their bases moved Death Guard overseers and work gangs of the infected dead. The penal troops reached them in broken remnants. They were butchered at once, but before the last signal died, picked capture caught the truth. The elevators were shielded, defended, and active. They led upward toward one of the 7 fortress keeps. The hololith sharpened. 3 strategic wounds glowed across the invasion map. Plague-burst artillery pits beneath the fungal canopy. Demon engine warrens under the western basin. Mountain elevator route toward the fortress keep. For the first time since planetfall, Tyberos moved. One clawed hand rose and pointed toward the map. There. The strategium obeyed. Strike paths formed. Kill corridors adjusted. Devourer assault. Cadres received approach vectors. Red Brethren teleport contingencies locked into probability chains. The dying below had bought the first cuts into Mortarion's world. Down in the lowlands, the last major penal block ceased to exist as a human formation. Its men were scattered, eaten, drowned, infected, shot apart, or converted. Some still fought alone in the fog. One condemned soldier with a broken mask and half his face blistered to the bone kept firing his shotgun into a tide of poxwalkers until the weapon clicked empty. He drew a knife, screamed the Emperor's name, and was dragged beneath grey hands. His collar detonated under the mud. The blast marked another sink trench. The Carcharodon Auspex officer recorded it. On the plague planet, death was information. In the Black Manse, Mortarion listened to the lowlands. He did not require mortal reports. The fog brought him everything: the taste of fear, the pattern of shelling, the distribution of dying lungs, the shape of command hidden behind sacrifice. He sensed millions of little lives fed into his world, not in panic, not in hope, but deliberately. They were not crusaders pressing forward beneath banners. They were probes made of meat. They were fingers thrust into a trap to learn where the teeth closed. The Death Lord stood in a hall of hanging censers, each one filled with the ashes of conquered saints. Around him, plague adepts murmured calculations into bowls of bile. Death Shroud waited in alcoves, silent as execution. Far beneath the floor, disease factories beat like hearts. Mortarion remembered other invaders. He remembered the bright arrogance of loyal sons, who believed courage could become a wall against entropy. He remembered strategists who sought decisive engagement, saints who sought martyrdom, generals who sought victory, and fools who believed the Imperium's hunger for sacrifice made it pure. This was different. The Grey Fleet did not come with hope. It came with appetite. Mortarion's eyes narrowed behind his rebreather. Somewhere beneath the mountain fog, Tyberos of the Red Wake watched men die by the million and felt no need to pretend their deaths were noble. The Pale King understood then. This one had not come like Guilliman, with empire in his shadow. Not like Dawn, with walls in his soul. Not like a crusader. Not like a martyr. Not even like a hero. He had come like a predator, willing to feed his own limbs into the trap, to learn where the jaws were. Mortarion's voice moved through the black manse like poison entering water. Let him learn. The plague bells answered from the mountains. Planetfall began when the lowlands were already full of dead men. The first invasion had been a ledger of sacrificed flesh. The second was a blade. Drop pods fell through the poisoned heavens in black clusters, their heat shields burning corpse green as they punched through cloud layers thick enough to stain Auspec's returns. Boarding torpedoes, stripped of void grapnels and refitted for atmospheric violence, screamed beside them like iron coffins hurled by angry gods. Thunderhawk gunships descended in predatory wedges, wings filmed with acid condensation, their assault cannons cycling before they found targets. Heavy landers followed in staggered waves, each one dragging contrails of fire through the chemical murk, each one carrying armor, dreadnought sarcophagi, devourer assault packs, munitions pallets, and mortals already marked as expendable by proximity. The plague planet did not receive them. It tried to digest them. The clouds closed around the incoming craft in folds of living vapor. Acid fog slithered across hull plating and found every seam. Warning runes flashed within cockpits. Machine spirits snarled Binharic complaints as atmospheric toxins scraped at ceramite, adamantium, plasteel, glass, and sacred paint. Wards blackened. Purity seals curled and dissolved. In the crew bay of a descending Thunderhawk, a mortal bondsman looked down at his gloves and watched the leather bubble. He tried to pray, but his rebreather filled with wet laughter that was not carried by any vox channel. The pilot kept the gunship steady until his left cheek liquefied beneath his flight helm. He did not scream. His jaw slid away in strings and slapped against his collar. His co-pilot, already blind from pus that had burst behind his eyes, continued chanting altitude markers in a voice reduced to bubbling clicks. Behind them, Carcharodon warriors stood locked in the troop bay, silent inside sealed plate, while biological contamination warnings crawled across their retinal displays. The plague was not inside their armor. Not yet. Still, it registered across every joint, every gasket, every elbow seal and knee ridge, seeking entry with patient, loving malice. Atmospheric breach probability rising, voxed a tech marine. Acceptable, answered the strike leader. Below, the land burned with the remains of the red tithe. The lowlands were no longer merely swamp and fog. They were proof. Bodies lay in windrows where plague mortars had harvested them. Collapsed penal ranks formed red-brown causeways through the mire. Men still wearing explosive collars twitched in the slime, not alive enough to beg and not dead enough to be ignored. Poxwalkers fed upon them, or rose from among them, or dragged them under to become part of the deep rot beneath the surface. Across the basin, the Death Guard's hidden guns had revealed themselves by killing. Now they would be answered. The first drop pods struck among the artillery nests. They hit like meteor judgment, cracking black stone and fungal plates, throwing diseased mud in great fans across cultist gun crews. Hatches blew outward. Grey warriors emerged into poison mist, with bolters raised and chain blades already shrieking. Devourer assault squads ignited their jump packs before the fog had finished curling around them. They rose above the cratered earth in bursts of flame, then fell upon the plague artillery pits with the blunt hunger of sharks entering bloodwater. cultist crews died in heaps. They were fever-swollen things, proud of their mutations, their robes crusted with ordure and battlefield grease. Some were chained to loading wheels. Some kissed shells before ramming them into rusted mortar tubes. Some had faces hidden behind masks made from loyalist skulls. The Devourers gave them no time for hymns. Chain blades tore through arms, throats, and swollen bellies. Bolt pistols hammered at point-blank range. A cultist with 3 mouths tried to spit a curse and lost all of them to a chainsword that carved him from brow to sternum. Another raised a plague icon stitched from flayed skin, and a Carcharodon took his arm at the shoulder, then kicked him beneath the recoil tracks of his own mortar. Prometheum washed the pits. The smell was holy and vile, cleansing flame drowned by the sweetness of rot. Cultists burned while laughing. Their fat popped. Their eyes ran down their faces. Some continued loading shells with arms that were already blackened to bone, until bolter fire broke them apart. The Devourers moved from pit to pit, jump packs howling, slaughtering crews, placing melter charges, and marking ammunition shrines for orbital correction. For a moment, the Death Guard guns fell silent. Then the Plague Burst crawlers spoke. The first shell descended without warning, fat and rust-streaked, trailing corpse vapor. It landed among a cluster of newly established Carcharodon teleport beacons and burst open with a wet thunderclap. Corrosive spore cloud rolled outward, green-white and alive. Mortal auxiliaries nearest the blast did not fall so much as become puddles. Skin left bone in sheets. Bones softened, bent, and collapsed into armor. A loader serf clawed at his chest as his ribs dissolved around his hearts. His mouth opened to scream, but his tongue had become fluid and poured down his chin. The cloud kissed Space Marine armor next. Ceramite pitted within seconds. Ancient grey plate blistered and rusted where no rust should take hold. One Devourer's helm lenses cracked inward, the contamination seals screaming red. He continued firing until a second shell detonated behind him and drove shrapnel through his backplate. His twin hearts sprayed against the inside of his armor. He fell to one knee, tried to rise, and was struck by a third shell that reduced him and the 3 brothers beside him to broken limbs and fragments of steaming ceramite. Across the landing zones, the bombardment intensified. Plague Burst crawlers, hidden beneath overgrowth and corpse camouflage, fired in deliberate sequence, walking their shells across the drop fields. The ground became a cauldron. Heavy landers slammed down through smoke and were struck before their ramps could fully lower. One craft disgorged a predator tank into the mire, only for a plague shell to burst beneath its tracks and vomit acid upward through the engine vents. The tank cooked from within. Its crew burned inside their sealed compartment, fists hammering once against armor that did not open. "Landing zone second ash is untenable," voxed a Carcharodon officer. "Withdraw by squads," came the reply from the Nicor. "Leave immobilized assets." A dreadnought of the chapter strode from a fractured lander into the fog, sarcophagus seals steaming, assault cannon roaring. His name was carved upon his chassis in old script and shark tooth marks, but the lowlands did not care for names. Poxwalkers burst under his tread. Cultist barricades vanished beneath his fire. Then the mire ahead heaved, and my Phytic blight haulers came hunting. They crawled low through the filth, demon engines of rusted iron and swollen organic machinery, their frontal plates grinning like diseased beasts. Missile launchers spat trails through the fog. Multi-melters glowed with obscene heat. The first beam struck a Carcharodon land raider in the side armor. Adamantium ran like candle wax. The transport slewed, weapons still firing, before a second blight hauler hit the front glacis and turned the crew compartment into a furnace. The ramp blew open. The assault squad inside emerged burning, armor wreathed in flame and plague steam, still firing bolters as they advanced 3 steps and collapsed one by one. The dreadnought charged. His power fist caught the nearest blight hauler and punched through its front plating. The demon engine screamed through vox, engine, and throat at once. He tore out a mass of cabling, intestine, and black iron. A second blight hauler fired into his flank. The melter wash burned through sarcophagus armor. Within the coffin, the ancient warrior roared a Binharic curse and slewed his assault cannon across the attacker, chewing it open from launcher to belly. A third engine rammed him through the hip joint, and both vanished beneath a boiling plume as plague slime detonated around them. The dreadnought's final transmission was a growl, still serving. Then his rune went black. In orbit, Tyberos watched the ground war unfold as intersecting wounds across the hololith. The first wave had revealed the guns. The second was revealing the counterattack. The plague planet spent filth, dead, machines, and patience. The Carcharodons spent lives. Between them, the lowlands became arithmetic, written in blood, rust, and heat. "Largest artillery concentration remains active," said an Auspex officer. "Coordinates confirmed. Heavy Terminator signatures detected within pit complex." "Blight Lords," said Akuru. Tyberos's helm turned slightly. "Red Brethren." The teleportarium chambers answered. Crimson light swallowed the elite of the chapter. They arrived inside the largest artillery pit in a storm of displaced air and murderous intent. The pit was not a simple gun emplacement, but a sunken fortress of earth, iron, and meat, built around siege mortars, whose barrels were ribbed with demon bone. Ammunition cradles were fed by chains of poxwalkers. Cult magi poured vats of plague slurry over shells, while chanting through throats full of flies. The floor was layered with spent casings, teeth, devotional scraps, and the compacted remains of prisoners used to bless the guns. The Red Brethren opened fire. Storm bolters tore through cultists, servitors, and poxwalker loaders. Chain fists revved. Lightning claws crackled. The artillery crews disappeared beneath disciplined brutality. Then the far wall of the pit split open, and the Blight Lord Terminators came. They emerged slowly, as if time owed them passage. Their armor was swollen and ancient. Cataphractii and Indomitus patterns corrupted past sanctity, marked with cracked bells, hanging sensors, horn growths, and tubes that pulsed with dark fluid. Their weapons were made for close killing. Flails whose heads moaned, bubotic axes, combi bolters with barrels crusted by disease, chain fists choked with rust, but still strong enough to open battleplate. The two lines met without a roar. The impact was tectonic. A Red Brother drove his chain fist into a Blight Lord's torso and tore upward, opening armor and belly in a flood of rot. The Death Guard warrior answered by smashing a plague flail across the Red Brother's helm. The first blow cracked the faceplate, the second crushed the skull beneath. The third pulped everything above the gorget, yet the Carcharodon's chain fist continued to chew until the Blight Lord's spine parted. Power fists struck like falling anvils. Chain blades screamed against plate too stubborn to die. A rusted axe cleaved through a Red Brethren's shoulder guard, through the arm beneath, and into the chest cavity. The Carcharodon leaned forward, trapping the blade in his body long enough for another brother to punch lightning claws through the Death Guard's visor and rip the head apart from within. Black matter sprayed across both warriors. The Blight Lord's body kept walking until a thunderhammer broke both knees. The artillery pit became a bowl of transhuman ruin. Above it, Thunderhawks hunted through acid cloud, strafing demon engine warrens with lascannons and missiles. Below them, Devourers struck, vanished, and struck again. When one advance route filled with plague fire, the Carcharodons did not feed it more warriors for pride. They withdrew into fog, abandoned the wounded who could not move under seal, and hit another angle. When cultist hordes gathered around false beacons, orbital shells erased them. When the Death Guard advanced too slowly to catch a retreating kill team, the Carcharodons lured them through contaminated wreckage, then detonated the ground beneath their boots. It was not glorious war. It was predation. Squads appeared where the enemy had counted emptiness. They withdrew before attrition could root them in place. They used dead penal battalions as landmarks, burning land raiders as cover, and plague smoke as concealment. Every failure became information. Every wound became map data. Every abandoned brother became a fixed point in the equation until his gene seed was either recovered or denied. The weakness came from a dying serf beneath a corpse canal. He had been part of a beacon team sent through the flooded trenches between the central basin and the lower fortress road. The canal was a sluggish artery filled with bodies from earlier wars, some imperial, some Death Guard, some impossible to identify. The surface was filmed with grey fat. Corpse gas bubbled up through hair, hands, and broken helmets. The serf's squad had been taken by things beneath the surface, one after another, pulled down without screams because their throats filled too quickly. He survived because his legs were gone. Pinned against a rusted intake grate, he transmitted through a cracked vox bead while infection climbed his spine. "Metal beneath canal," he whispered. "Large pipe, manufacturum scale, heat signature, fluid movement, shield resonance. Emperor, forgive me, something is pumping below the dead." The signal degraded into choking, then song. The Auspex officers caught the data before his rune vanished. A buried manufacturum pipeline ran beneath the corpse canal, shielded by filth, bodies, and false thermal ghosts. It carried alchemical slurry from the disease factories toward generator nodes feeding the lower fortress road. The road itself was protected by a shimmering plague ward and void shield hybrid, a sickly curtain of force that had turned lance fire aside and spoiled teleport solutions. The pipeline was not merely supply, it was blood. Tyberos studied the projection. The pipeline lay beneath friendly positions, now occupied by 3 Carcharodon squads, 2 crippled dreadnought shells, several mortal support teams, and wounded awaiting gene seed extraction. Breaching it would open the route. It would also flood the canal and adjacent low ground with whatever the Death Guard used to feed their shields. Akuru looked from the map to the red wake. No one asked the question this time. Tyberos gave the order. "Breach it." Melter charges were placed by warriors who knew they would not withdraw beyond the floodline. They worked waist-deep in corpse water, cutting through armor plates grown over the pipe like scabs. Poxwalkers clawed at them. Plague rounds stitched the canal banks. A blight hauler fired from the fog and killed half the team in one burst, bodies tumbling into the sludge with armor smoking. The survivors continued the right. One brother lost an arm to a submerged thing and held the charge in place with his remaining hand until another locked the final seal. "Charge is ready," voxed the squad leader. "Detonate," said Tyberos. The canal rose. The explosion did not sound like metal breaking. It sounded like a continent vomiting. The buried pipeline split along its length, and plague slurry erupted from beneath the corpses in a towering black-green flood. It swallowed the canal banks, the dead, the living, the wounded, and the warriors who had placed the charges. Entire squads vanished standing, their armor filled through weakened seals, not with water, but with rot that had pressure, teeth, and prayer. One Carcharodon remained upright for several seconds as the flood climbed over his helm, bolter still firing beneath the surface. His last rounds detonated as muted flashes under the sludge. Then his rune failed. Mortal auxiliaries dissolved where the slurry touched them. Men became silhouettes, then skeletons, then nothing but equipment drifting in filth. A wounded space marine tried to drag himself from the flood with one arm, his lower body already gone inside his armor. An apothecary reached for him, saw the corruption warnings spike, and shot him through the helm before the wave took them both. The slurry poured across the lowlands and into the generator culverts. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the shield above the lower fortress road flickered. It shimmered, sickly green turning thin and unstable. Mountain batteries lost synchrony. Teleport interference buckled. The road, a vast black causeway climbing from the basin toward the first fortress elevations, appeared through the fog like a blade laid against a corpse. Tyberos leaned forward by the smallest degree. "Mark assault vectors." The Carcharodon fleet answered with fire. Drop pods redirected. Thunderhawks banked toward the opening. Devourer squads disengaged from doomed fights and vanished into the fog, only to reappear along the newly exposed approaches. Red Brethren in the artillery pit detonated the last of the great mortars, breaking the spine of the bombardment long enough for the next wave to move. The plague planet shook beneath the combined thunder of invasion and infection. Its lowlands burned, its swamps drank, its dead rose, its guns reloaded. In the black manse, Mortarion stood before a window of cracked bone and watched the lower clouds pulse with distant fire. Reports came to him as odors, as fever patterns, as the music of dying lungs. The grey invaders had found a vein and cut it, uncaring that their own warriors drowned in the blood. They climbed now, not quickly, not proudly, but inevitably enough to warrant a sharper instrument. Behind him, alcoves opened one by one. The death shroud awakened. They stepped from shadow and incense, immense in corrupted Terminator plate, their scythes held with the stillness of executioners who had never doubted the sentence. They did not ask who they were to kill. They had been made for proximity to death, for the last pace before silence, for the intimate murder of those who thought themselves mighty. Mortarion's wings shifted. Grave dust spilled from them in soft curtains. His voice entered the fog, the bells, the vox static, the mouths of plague prophets, and the wet lungs of the newly dead. Let the grey things climb. The mountain has missed the taste of loyal suns. The war slowed when the road opened. That was the first lesson the plague planet taught the Carcharodons. Speed belonged to the void, to the sudden strike, to the boarding hook and the teleport flare, to the silent blade opening a throat before the prey knew it had been chosen. Down in the low fog, speed drowned. It sank into the mire with the dead. It caught on rust trees, corpse wire, trenches filled with old meat, and rivers that moved with the reluctance of clotted blood. The Carcharodons climbed by killing. They moved beyond the drowned pipeline and into the low fog belt, where the fortress road rose in broken stages toward the mountain wall. The shield above it still flickered where the alchemical feed had been wounded, but the road itself was half buried beneath centuries of rot. On either side lay swamps whose surfaces quivered with trapped gas and submerged bodies. Corpse villages sagged along the banks, their huts made from bone, scrap iron, plague hide, and the fused armor of men who had died in forgotten wars. The windows watched without eyes. The doors breathed. The rust forests began beyond them. Iron trunks rose from the mire in crooked ranks, their bark flaking away in red-black scabs. Chains hung from the branches. Some held bells. Some held skeletons. Some held men who were still alive enough to twitch when the Carcharodons passed beneath them. Their mouths were stuffed with fungus, their bellies opened and planted with small devotional gardens of mold. The fog moved among the trunks in slow folds, thick enough to swallow sound, thick enough to turn Auspex returns into ghost shapes and lies. Trenches cut through everything. They were not dug so much as worn into the world by centuries of siege and disease. Their walls were made from compacted corpses, layered so densely that skulls jutted from the sides like cobbles. Boots sank into mud that had been men for longer than memory. Fingers surfaced in the sludge. Teeth clicked underfoot. When shell bursts shook the ground, bubbles rose from the trench floors and burst with the smell of graves opened in summer. The Carcharodons advanced through this without complaint. They formed kill lanes where the terrain allowed. Heavy bolters were braced across broken masonry and rusted tank hulls. Flamers moved to the front under the guard of bolter lines. Assault cannons whined in the arms of Terminators and Dreadnoughts, their barrels spinning before targets appeared. Chainswords were checked, oiled, and held ready. No one wasted speech. The poxwalkers came in oceans. They did not attack as soldiers. They had no ranks, no pace, no command hierarchy that mortal minds could recognize. They rose from swamps, poured from corpse villages, climbed from trenches, spilled out of rust forests, and pushed through their own dead with the patience of water finding a crack. Their numbers seemed less an army than a weather condition, a tide of flesh, rags, bone, sores, swollen tongues, open bellies, and smiling rot. The first waves hit the forward trenches and filled them. Flamers answered. Promethium roared through the fog in golden white torrents, washing over the dead and turning the trench line into a canal of burning bodies. Poxwalkers burned and kept coming. Their skin split. Their hair vanished. Fat ran from them in sizzling streams. They crawled beneath the flames, climbed over the blackened heaps of their own, and threw themselves into the muzzles of the flamers until the weapons choked on cooked meat. Heavy bolters opened. Mass reactive shells tore lanes through the press, detonating torsos, heads, and limbs into wet fragments. A poxwalker, with a naval officer's cap, lost everything above the jaw and continued walking until a second shell burst in its chest. A cluster of dead guardsmen, still wearing cracked rebreathers, vanished under assault cannon fire, their bodies reduced to shredded cloth and red mist. Chainswords screamed as the tide reached the line. Grey armored warriors cut with steady economy, severing necks, arms, and spines, never giving ground unless ordered. Each destroyed wave left a gift. The ground became a slick of infected sludge. Twitching limbs crawled underfoot. Severed heads mouthed prayers in voices that were not their own. A hand without an arm clutched the ankle seal of a mortal ammunition bearer and tore out the gasket with patient fingers. He screamed once before the fog entered his suit. His face swelled against the visor until the armor glass cracked. He fell, convulsing, and the nearest Carcharodon shot him through the head without breaking formation. Simple proximity killed the mortals. Those who were not bitten still sickened. Those who did not breathe the fog still heard the groans. Those who were not wounded still began to weep pus. A bondsman carrying heavy bolter drums dropped to his knees and vomited a stream of black beetles into the mud. Another turned his last pistol on himself, only for his fingers to fuse around the grip before he could pull the trigger. The poxwalkers reached him and opened him with their teeth, while he begged the Emperor to let him die faster. The Carcharodons used the mortals until the mortals ceased to be useful. Then they burned them. Akuru led one of the forward strike groups through the corpse village of Hadrath Sink, though no living record named it so. He had learned the name from the dead, carved into the lintel of a chapel built from rib bones. His squad moved between leaning huts, bolters shouldered, chainswords low. The fog carried little sounds, wet feet, choked laughter, the clink of bells. Somewhere inside the village, a child's song rose and fell in a language that had never belonged to mankind. There were no children there, only poxwalkers packed into the houses so tightly they pressed against the walls from within. The first hut burst outward as the squad passed. Dead bodies spilled into the street like offal from a split gut. Akuru fired into them, his bolter hammering, each shot a point of brief, disciplined thunder. Brother Rauk advanced beside him with a flamer, washing the doorway until the interior became a furnace. Something large moved behind the burning dead, and Brother Samor met it with a chain blade two-handed, cutting through a swollen torso that burst over him in a flood of green fluid. Contamination warning, Samor voxed. Seal integrity. Compromised at left vambrace. Continue, said Akuru. They continued. At the far end of the village, Death Guard plague marines emerged from the fog. They did not rush. They did not shout. They advanced as the poxwalkers died around them, old legionaries in corrupted plate, their armor bloated with pipes, bells, and horn growths, their lenses burning dull yellow in the murk. Bolter fire struck them and detonated. They rocked. They endured. Chunks of armor blew away to reveal wet flesh, rusted bone, and organs that pulsed with unnatural calm. They kept walking. Their return fire was precise. Plague bolt guns barked in measured volleys. Brother Rauk's flamer tank ruptured under a mass-reactive shell and engulfed him in fire. He remained standing long enough to direct the blast toward the poxwalkers before collapsing into molten ceramite and blackened meat. Brother Samor took a blight launcher round to the chest. The shell punched through his breastplate, detonated inside, and burst his back open in a spray of bone shards and shredded organs. He fell without a word. His gene seed rune flashed amber. Akuru marked it. Apothecary required. Samor recoverable. Unable, came the reply. Contact heavy. A plague spewer roared. The stream struck Brother Hask from shoulder to knee. His armor smoked and sagged. He tried to step back, but the ground softened under him and swallowed one leg to the thigh. Poxwalkers surged over him. Hask fired his bolt pistol into their faces until a plague knife slid under his gorget from behind. Akuru saw the blade. He saw the Death Guard warrior holding it, half hidden behind a curtain of skin hung from a rust tree. Not a plague marine of the line, but a lesser champion or plague knife bearer, its armor crawling with fly larvae. The blade had entered Hask beneath the helm seal. Hask turned his lenses toward Akuru. Strike leader. The infection moved visibly. Black veins spread across Hask's neck, where the armor had split. His secondary heart rate spiked, then faltered. The plague was intelligent enough to race for the organs that mattered. The progenoid glands would not remain sacred for long. Recover my seed, Hask said. Akuru did not hesitate. Hold him. Two brothers seized Hask by the shoulders, even as he began to convulse. His arms thrashed with strength that was no longer entirely his own. He laughed once, and the sound did not belong to him. Akuru stepped close, placed his bolt pistol under Hask's chin, and fired. The helm burst upward in red mist and broken lens glass. The apothecary arrived through the fog like a butcher priest, Narthecium already extended. Plague rounds snapped past him. Poxwalkers clawed at his legs. He ignored them. The reductor punched through Hask's chest and throat in swift, brutal motions. Sacred organs were cut free, slick with blood and blackening fluid. One gland was intact. The other twitched in the forceps and began to grow pale tendrils. The apothecary crushed the corrupted one in his fist and sealed the other. Half recovered, he voxed. Continue advance, said Akuru. Behind the Death Guard line, horns sounded from the fog. The Lord of Contagion entered the war like a fortress learning to walk. He came in cataphractii plate swollen past all noble proportion, a towering mass of rusted ceramite, cracked brass, hanging bells, and fly-blown banners. His armor was the color of grave mold and old bone, its plates pitted by 10,000 wars, and blessed with every foulness Nurgle could press into iron. Pipes fed from his back into his helm. His belly plate bulged outward, carved with a leering sigil that wept pus from its grooves. In his gauntlets, he carried a great plague axe, its blade broader than a mortal man, its edge crawling with black light.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
His name rolled through the fog in a chorus of diseased throats. Vauxhall, Moldborn, bellkeeper of the lower road, breaker of sealed lungs, tallyman of the patient rot. He brought plague marines with him, and behind them more dead. The push hit 3 Carcharodon squads at once. The first squad disappeared beneath plague spewer fire and poxwalker mass. The second tried to reposition through a trench, only for its floor to collapse into a pit of decomposed bodies and rusted spikes. Death Guard bolter fire caught them as they climbed, bursting armor and exposing wet transhuman meat to the fog. The third squad met Vauxhall directly. They struck him with melter, bolter, and blade. He walked through it. A melter blast burned half the bells from his shoulder and exposed a ribcage fused with iron beneath. He laughed, a deep, wet tolling sound, and brought his axe down. The first Carcharodon he hit split from helm to pelvis, both halves falling in opposite directions, while the organs between steamed in the open air. A thunderhammer struck Vauxhall's knee and cracked the armor. He answered with a backhand that caved the attacker's chest into his spine. His plague aura thickened. Flesh blistered inside sealed plate. Mortal serfs died in circles around him, collapsing with faces melted into expressions of wonder. Akuru's squad fell back by order, not fear. Vauxhall advanced, dragging death with him. He smashed through a broken rhino hull and tore a wounded Carcharodon from beneath it, holding the warrior up by the head while the plague axe rested against his torso. The axe pressed gently. Armor parted. Bone parted. The warrior's body opened in a wet curtain from throat to groin. Vauxhall dropped him and kept coming. "Lord Reaper," Akuru voxed. "Enemy command asset identified. Terminator plate. Heavy contagion field. 3 squads broken." The answer came after a breath. "Mark position." Akuru activated the beacon. The fog became still. Then something moved within it that made even the poxwalkers pause. Tyberos came without escort. He emerged from the low fog as a shape too large for silence, and yet silent all the same. His modified Terminator plate was scarred from the void battle and pitted by planetary poison, but he moved as if the world's malice were merely weather. Hunger and Slake hung at his sides, chain teeth turning slowly. The poxwalkers nearest him changed direction, drawn by living meat and sacred hatred. He killed them without looking, claws passing through heads and spines as he walked. Vauxhall saw him and stopped. The Lord of Contagion's laugh rolled through the trench line. "Red Wake," he said. "At last, the deep sends something worth rotting." Tyberos did not answer. Vauxhall swung first. The plague axe cut through the fog in a heavy arc. Tyberos stepped inside it, not away. The blade scraped across his shoulder plate, carving a smoking groove. Hunger punched into Vauxhall's side, chain teeth biting through cataphracti plate with a howl of tortured metal. Slake followed into the exposed joint beneath the arm. Black fluid burst across Tyberos's gauntlet. Vauxhall brought his elbow down like a siege ram. The blow struck Tyberos's helm and cracked the outer plating. Tyberos drove forward, shoulder into belly, and forced the larger corruption back through the mud. The Lord of Contagion tried to trap him with the haft of the axe. Hunger severed 3 fingers. Slake opened the wrist. The axe fell, half embedded in the trench floor. Vauxhall's belly split where the claws had struck, spilling loops of intestine thick as cables. They writhed and tried to crawl back inside him. Flies poured from the wound in a black cloud. The Lord laughed again and reached with his remaining hand for Tyberos's throat. Tyberos caught the arm. For the first time he spoke. "You mistake endurance for strength." He pulled. The arm tore free at the shoulder with a sound like wet timber breaking. Vauxhall staggered. Regrowth began almost at once, pale grubs knitting muscle and black veins across the stump. Tyberos stepped closer. Hunger and Slake rose together and struck into the Lord of Contagion's helm. The first impact split the faceplate. The second opened the skull beneath. The third drove the entire head backward into the gorget, crushing horn, bone, rebreather, and the wet mass inside. Vauxhall's body kept standing. Bells tolled from his armor. A laugh gurgled from the ruin of his head, low and bubbling. Tyberos placed one massive clawed hand over the crushed helm and squeezed. The skull collapsed completely. Brain, pus, and black ichor burst through the cracks and ran over his fingers. Still, somewhere within the broken head, something laughed. Tyberos turned away. "Burn it until the skull stops laughing." The order was obeyed. Prometheum teams advanced under heavy bolter cover. They poured fire over Vauxhall's remains until the cataphractii plate glowed red, until the flesh inside charred and split, until the bells melted and ran in bronze tears down the armor. The laughter continued for longer than any sane thing should have endured. At last, it became a hiss, then a bubbling whisper. then nothing but burning fat and popping bone. The corpse canal route opened under the shadow of that fire. The Carcharodons drove forward, but the price lay everywhere. Thousands of mortal auxiliaries dead in the trenches and swamp approaches. Multiple squads reduced below combat strength. Armor assets burning in plague steam. Gene seed recovered from some, denied in others, lost beneath the mire where not even an apothecary could reach without becoming part of the tally. Heavy bolter barrels glowed. Flamer tanks ran dry. Chainsword teeth clogged with diseased gristle. Every warrior's armor carried contamination scars. Every seal bore the patient pressure of the world trying to enter. Worse, the plague was learning. The apothecaries saw it first. Infection vectors began changing shape around Carcharodon biology. Spores collected near joints, most stressed by their attack patterns. Viral agents thickened around their blood chemistry. Poxwalkers struck at seal points with unnatural insistence. Plague knives sought progenoid regions. The world, the Death Guard, and whatever listened behind them were studying the Grey Invaders as carefully as the Grey Invaders studied the world. Ahuru understood then why Tyberos had spent mortals first. The planet was not merely killing them, it was remembering them. By the time the Carcharodons reached the lower rise beyond the Corpse Canal, the fog ahead had thinned just enough to show the mountain pass. It waited between two cliffs of black stone, veined with green light. Chains crossed overhead in vast arcs, each one hung with bodies in Carcharodon grey, imperial uniforms, and ancient armor too corroded to name. The road beyond climbed toward the first fortress keep, but the way narrowed there. Too narrow for armor to maneuver freely, too steep for easy withdrawal, too quiet for a world that had spent the last hours roaring. The Death Guard were no longer merely resisting. They were shaping the invasion. Their artillery withdrew from certain lanes. Poxwalker tides broke in ways that encouraged pursuit. Plague Marine squads yielded ground they could have held longer. The demon engines circled wide rather than pressing the newly opened route. The Carcharodons saw it. They recorded it. They understood. A trap that could be seen was still a trap, if the objective lay beyond it. High above, in the black manse, death-shroud terminators stood ready in the mountain dark. Their scythes were still. Their armor exhaled rot. They waited where Mortarion had placed them, not to repel the grey suns from the road, but to teach them the cost of climbing it. In the low fog, Tyberos looked toward the pass. His claws dripped with the remains of the Lord of Contagion. "Advance," he said. The mountain pass did not end. It narrowed until it became a throat. The Carcharodons climbed through it beneath chains so vast they vanished into the fog above, each link crusted with old blood, plague salts, and the petrified remains of hands nailed there in supplication. Bodies hung from them in layers. Imperial soldiers, penal thralls, priests in greened vestments, plague cultists who had pleased their masters by dying slowly, warriors in ancient power armor whose colors had been eaten by rust and disease. Some corpses were old enough to have become part of the metal. Some were fresh enough to bleed when the wind moved them. No unaugmented mortal survived the ascent without sealed armor. Even then, survival was temporary. The fog thickened with altitude. It pressed against the Carcharodons like damp cloth dragged from a mass grave. It entered cracked helms, chewed seals, filmed lenses, and turned exposed metal dull within moments. Mortal auxiliaries who stumbled outside protection liquefied in pieces. A bondsman lost a glove while hauling ammunition up the broken road. His hand swelled, split, and ran off his wrist in a red-grey slurry before he could scream. The nearest serf cut his arm away with a utility saw and pushed him onward until the man collapsed, vomiting his lungs into his mask. Above them, the keep emerged. It was not built on the mountain. It had infected it. The citadel rose from the black cliffs as a mass of rusted bastions, iron towers, diseased stone, and demonic growth, its walls ribbed like the carapace of some buried beast. plague bells hung from archways large enough to swallow titans. Their slow tolling made the fog ripple. Chains of corpses draped from battlements and murder holes, each body branded with devotional script to the plague god. Gun towers jutted from the rock in clustered layers, surrounded by bulbous growths that pulsed and spat vapor over the lower approaches. It was one of the 7 great keeps of the Plague Planet's damned order, a fortress of the Death Guard's plague companies, ancient enough to remember wars that loyal history had burned from its books. Its outer defenses had been waiting. Blightlord Terminators stood upon the lower walls like diseased statues, massive in corrupted plate, their combi bolters angled downward, their axes and flails resting against parapets slick with rot. Plague Marines manned firing tiers and collapsed chapel windows, unhurried and silent behind cracked lenses. Noxious Blightbringers moved among them, carrying bells and censers, each toll sending waves of weakness through mortal bones and making the wounded cough black phlegm into their helms. Below, cultist masses clustered in the trenches and scaffold fields, chanting through split mouths, beating drums made from stretched loyalist skin. Demon engines crouched in gun pits, chained to stone anchors, their weapons twitching as if eager to be allowed off the leash. The keep did not need to move, it only had to endure. That was the Death Guard way. Let the enemy climb, let him fire, let him spend ammunition, breath, blood, and certainty. Let him exhaust himself against walls that did not fear pain. Then, when his advance slowed, and his weapons glowed, and his wounded began to call for medici aid, open the fog and walk forward. Tyberos understood it. He did not order a frontal siege. The Carcharodons struck everywhere at once. Red Brethren Terminators translated into the upper bastions in storms of crimson light, teleport flares blooming behind shielded gun towers and plague bell platforms. Their arrival tore cultists apart in pressure bursts and burned demon flies from the air. Storm bolters fired at once, cutting through bellkeepers, gunners, and robed plague adepts before they could complete their warning rites. Chain fists struck into tower machinery. Lightning claws opened Blightlord armor at the joints. The upper keep convulsed around the sudden wound. Far below, scout elements moved like knife shadows through the rock chimneys beneath the outer wall. Their armor was darkened with ash and toxin paste, their helms sealed against the fog. They did not engage unless discovered. They marked shield pylons, vent ports, ammunition hoists, and corrupted machine shrines with silent beacons. One scout placed a marker beneath a demon-grown gargoyle, whose stone eyes followed him. When the thing opened its mouth to scream, he drove a combat blade into its throat and held it shut until the beacon armed. Devourer squads climbed the ventilation towers. They ascended by chain hooks, jump pack bursts, and sheer transhuman strength, moving over surfaces slick with mucus and acid runoff. Cultists above them leaned over with flamers and plague grenades. The first devourer to crest the lip of a vent tower was struck by a grenade that burst against his helm and filled the air with shrieking spores. His lenses blackened. He still vaulted over the edge and cut the thrower in half with a chainsword. The rest followed, bolt pistols roaring, chain blades carving through bodies packed shoulder to shoulder around the vents. At the lower gates, dreadnoughts advanced. The ancient dead of the chapter strode through plague fire, sarcophagi glowing with warning runes, assault cannons, and heavy flamers answering the gun pits. Their feet crushed poxwalkers into the road. Lascannon beams from the keep's lower towers burned across their armor. One dreadnought lost an arm to a multi-melter burst and used the smoking stump to batter a demon engine aside before his seismic hammer crushed its skull plate. Another walked into a trench full of cultists and rotated in place, assault cannon roaring until the trench became a red mist bowl filled with shredded limbs and fragments of devotional iron. The Death Guard absorbed the punishment. The upper bastions burned, and still the Blightlords came. The gatehouses shook, and still the plague guns fired. Shield pylons failed, and others awoke behind them. Plague Marines died beneath bolter volleys and rose again slowly, or crawled forward with their torsos open, firing from the ground while flies stitched their wounds. The defenders yielded chambers only after the cost of holding them had been charged to the enemy. They gave ground like a man offering spoiled meat to starving dogs. Then the contagion clouds rolled outward. The Carcharodon assault slowed. Vox channels filled with wet interference. Auspex returns multiplied into false shapes. The air around the walls turned viscous and yellow, thick with spores that clung to armor and crawled toward seals. Mortal ammunition haulers dropped where they stood, blood pouring from the vents of their masks. A devourer squad on the eastern ventilation crown found their jump packs clogging with fungal matter, turbines screaming until they burst. 2 warriors fell from the tower into the fog below, still alive, still transmitting impact data until poxwalkers pulled them beneath the corpse road. Plague Marines counterattacked through the clouds. They came at the moment the Loyalists were slowed and their ammunition lines disrupted. Bolters thudded. Blight launchers boomed. Plague spewers washed chambers in alchemical filth. The Death Guard did not chase kills. They applied pressure where the Carcharodons had already been wounded. They cut beacon teams from extraction routes. They fired on apothecaries. They targeted dreadnought joints and teleport anchors. They made every meter require another body. Then the Death Shroud appeared. They emerged from the gatehouse arch in silence. They were immense, swollen with Nurgle's gifts, their Terminator plate bloated and ancient, their helms like execution masks beneath horns and rebreather snouts. Their scythes were taller than mortal men, curved blades stained with toxins that smoked in the fog. They did not toll bells. They did not chant. They moved with a speed that mocked their bulk. The first Carcharodon to meet them swung a thunderhammer. The Death Shroud pivoted. The scythe flashed. The hammer arm came away at the shoulder, still clenched around the weapon. The second cut opened the warrior from hip to neck. His organs spilled in a steaming sheet across the gatestones, and the Death Shroud stepped through them without slowing. A devourer leapt from above. Chainsword aimed for the helm. A scythe butt caught him in mid-air and crushed his breastplate inward. Before he hit the ground, another blade took off his head. The helm bounced twice across the gatehouse floor, its lenses still glowing, blood pumping from the neck seal until pressure failed. The Carcharodons closed around them. Grey armor crashed into green and rust. Chain blades screamed against scythe hafts. Power fists struck. Lightning claws sparked. The Death Shroud cut back with terrible economy. They did not waste movement. Each sweep took limbs. Each thrust found joints. One Carcharodon was pinned through the chest to a gate pillar, the scythe blade punching through his back plate and into stone. He fired his bolt pistol into the Death Shroud's helm until the weapon clicked empty. The Death Shroud twisted the blade and split him open around it. The gatehouse became a butcher's chapel. Dead Space Marines from both sides lay packed across the floor. Carcharodon grey, split and punctured. Death Guard green, ruptured and leaking. Intestines dragged under boots. Spent shells floated in plague slime and blood. Ceramite shards crunched beneath advancing feet. Severed hands still gripped weapons. A broken Blight Lord crawled through the filth with one arm, trying to reach a fallen flail. A Carcharodon without legs rolled onto his back and fired upward until plague spewer fluid dissolved his helm and face together. Tyberos entered the gatehouse. He did not announce himself. He did not invoke the Emperor. He did not offer words to rally the warriors behind him. He simply killed the thing in front of him. Hunger caught a Death Shroud, scythe beneath the blade and dragged it aside. Slake struck the warrior's knee joint, chain teeth screaming through rusted plate and the meat beneath. The Death Shroud did not fall. It swung a gauntleted fist into Tyberos's chest with enough force to crack the stone under both of them. Tyberos accepted the impact, drove forward, and punched Hunger into the Terminator's torso. The weapon bit, caught, and tore. Diseased organs spilled out in black ropes. Slake rose and took the helm apart from the jaw upward. The second death shroud came from his left. Tyberos turned inside the sweep of the scythe. The blade scored his pauldron, shearing away a strip of ancient armor. He struck the shaft with one claw, severing it, then drove the other through the death shroud's throat seal. The chain teeth revved once. The head and collar assembly burst in a fountain of pus, bone, and helm fragments. His warriors followed because there was nothing else to do. Where Tyberos went, the breach widened. Where he stopped, bodies accumulated. He tore through cultist masses, broke plague marine lines by entering them, and walked through plague spewer fire until the weapon teams died under his claws. A noxious blightbringer struck his bell and made the air ripple with disease. Tyberos crossed the distance in 6 steps and ripped the bell from its frame, then crushed the bearer's skull inside it until the tolling stopped. The keep began to fail, by wounds too numerous to close. Upper bastion charges detonated. Scout-marked pylons burned under lance correction. Dreadnoughts forced the lower gate apart, even as one was swallowed by a chained demon engine that wrapped around his sarcophagus like a rusted serpent and tore him open. The ancient inside screamed defiance until his life support failed. The devourers broke the ventilation stacks and poured promethium down into the lower galleries, burning cult populations in their own warrens. In a reliquary chamber beneath the gatehouse, the Carcharodons found the plague caster. He was half fused into a growth of bone and parchment, his arms stretched across a lectern of infected skin, his eyes replaced by small buzzing mouths. Warding chains held him upright, though whether as prisoner, prophet, or organ of the keep was unclear. Around him lay shattered jars, filled with captured breath and teeth taken from loyal dead. He had survived the chamber's purge because something behind him wanted him to speak. Akuru put a bolt pistol to one of the mouths. "Where is the Barbaran crown?" The mouth smiled. "Not here, Grey Sun. Not in this keep. Not in any keep you may claw from the mountain." Tyberos stood behind Akuru, silent. The plague caster's many mouths trembled, but the smile remained. "You bleed stone and call it victory. The crown gestates below the Black Manse, in the disease factories beneath the Death Lord's shadow. 3 alchemical shield pylons feed it, 3 hearts of rot, 3 locks beneath the mountain, and above all of them, his warding, his breath, his patience." Akuru looked to Tyberos. The plague caster laughed through every mouth. "You have climbed into the hand, not the throat." Tyberos stepped forward. The laughter faltered. "Useful," said the Red Wake. Then Slake removed the plague caster's head, lectern, and upper torso in a single downward cut. The mouths continued whispering from the floor until a flamer reduced them to bubbling ash. The keep was no longer the objective. It was a cost. Tyberos opened the command channel. "Set melter charges through the lower galleries. Mark all pylons for orbital lance strike. Withdraw units able to disengage. Units unable to withdraw will continue killing until structural collapse." A pause followed across the Vox. Not refusal, calculation. Several Carcharodon squads remained trapped in the upper bastions, cut off by contagion clouds and Death Guard counterattacks. A Red Brethren detachment was still fighting inside a collapsed bell tower. 2 scout teams held beacon positions beneath shield shrines. A Devourer squad had breached too deep into the ventilation organs to return. They heard the order. They obeyed. Melter charges armed across the keep. Teleport homers flared and failed under plague interference. Orbital targeting solutions locked through gaps in the storm. The fleet above risked lance fire through the toxic cloud cover, threading beams between mountain batteries and fortress shields. The first lance struck the western bastion. White light punched through cloud and stone. The tower vanished, replaced by a pillar of molten rust and screaming vapor. The second strike cut across the upper wall, shearing gun platforms and bell frames into falling wreckage. The third entered the keep's central spine, where melter charges were already blooming. The citadel convulsed like a diseased animal, feeling the knife reach its heart. Inside, the trapped Carcharodons kept fighting. A Red Brother held a stairwell against plague marines until the ceiling came down and buried all of them together. A scout team transmitted shield pylon death confirmation, then detonated their own charges as poxwalkers poured into their crawl space. The last Devourer squad opened their helmets by choice, only long enough to shout a kill oath through the plague fog before igniting the Prometheum reserves beneath them. Their signal became fire. The keep collapsed in stages. Walls folded inward. Towers slid from the mountain and shattered on the corpse road below. Plague bells fell, their final tolls distorted by impact and flame. Demon growths ruptured and spilled oceans of green fluid down the cliffs. Cultist masses were crushed in their trenches. Plague marines vanished beneath stone, not all dead, but buried deeply enough to be irrelevant for the moment. The gatehouse split open, and the floor where space marines had killed one another disappeared beneath a grinding avalanche of intestines, armor, spent shells, and plague slime. Tyberos emerged from the ruin with fewer warriors than had entered. His armor smoked. One shoulder plate was half shorn away. Hunger and slake dripped with filth that purification oils could not wholly silence. Around him, surviving Carcharodons regrouped without cheers. Apothecaries moved among the fallen with knives ready. Serfs counted ammunition. Tech marines marked damaged armor. The objective had moved deeper. The price had increased. Above the broken keep, the mountain fog pulled back. It did not dissipate. It withdrew, like a curtain being drawn aside for a king. Across the storm-choked heights, beyond the collapsing fortress and the burning road, a silhouette descended from the clouds. Vast wings unfolded through green lightning. A long shape hung from one hand, curved and patient. The air itself bent around him, sickening, kneeling, remembering poison. For the first time since the invasion began, Mortarion did not watch as a distant master. He came as a hunter. The surviving Carcharodons raised their weapons. Tyberos looked up into the storm. The winged shadow descended. The route beneath the fallen keep led not up, but down. The mountain had been hollowed by industry older than the memory of loyal men. Beneath the shattered citadel, beneath the gatehouse where Carcharodon and Deathguard dead lay crushed together in steaming layers, the road broke into iron descents, conveyor gulfs, freight chasms, and rusted arterial tunnels wide enough to march armored battalions through. The air that rose from them was worse than the fog above. It did not drift. It breathed. The surviving invasion force descended into the disease factories of the plague planet. They were continent-scale abominations, not manufactoria as the Imperium built them, but mockeries of production, devotion, and biology fused into one vast engine of rot. Vats larger than cathedrals bubbled beneath chains of black iron. Cages hung in tiers beyond sight, each one packed with slaves, plague cultists, failed hosts, captured soldiers, and things that had been altered so many times that their original species no longer mattered. Alchemical rivers moved through channels cut into the floor, carrying yellow bile, grey blood, black mucus, and powdered bone toward demon-bound machinery whose gears chewed without pause. Above it all rose the shield pylons. There were 3 of them, each rooted deep in the factory complex and climbing through the smog like the ribs of a dead god. Their surfaces were carved with contagion scripture, welded skulls, and iron pipes, fat with pressure. Around their crowns, green lightning crawled upward into the mountain. They fed the warding that protected the deeper approaches. They fed the hidden engines beneath the black manse. They fed the Barbaran crown. The objective became clear, with the cruelty of a blade pressed to a throat. Destroy the first pylon. Overload the second. Seize or break the third. Open the route beneath the black manse. Everything else was ash. Tyberos gave the order, and the Carcharodons became more terrible. The worker populations of the disease factories had no category that permitted mercy. Some were infected slaves, some plague cult laborers, some vat-grown men bred to suffer, some prisoners who had lived too long beneath the hands of plague surgeons. Some were mortals who still wore scraps of imperial uniform and stared at the grey warriors with pleading eyes. The Carcharodons burned them all. Flamers walked the cage tiers. Promethium poured through the bars and turned packed bodies into columns of shrieking fire. Rad weapons hummed in the hands of sealed kill teams, poisoning chambers where too many bodies moved to count. Men hammered at cage doors until their fingers snapped. Some begged for the Emperor, some begged for Nurgle, some begged for names they had forgotten. The flames answered with equal purity. Akuru saw one prisoner reach through the bars toward him. The man's skin was stretched thin over a body swollen with plague sacs. His eyes were still clear. His mouth formed words that the Vox did not bother to translate. Akuru fired once. The head burst against the rear of the cage, and the bodies behind him caught the fragments. "Chamber cleared," he voxed. "Mark it sterile," came the answer. Sterile did not mean clean. Nothing in the factory could ever be clean. It meant incapable of serving the enemy in the next breath. The Death Guard answered from the vats. Foul blight spawn emerged in rubberized armor and bloated helms, dragging diseased tanks and sprayer engines that sloshed with fluids distilled from worlds. They laughed through cracked respirators as they opened their weapons. Streams of plague chemical roared across walkways and down corridors, not like flame, but like liquid decomposition. One stream struck a mortal ammunition bearer and reduced him to a skeleton wrapped in collapsing cloth before his bones themselves sagged into paste. Another washed over a Carcharodon shield line, eating at ceramite, seeping through damaged seals, and filling helms with vapor thick enough to drown transhuman lungs. Plague surgeons worked behind them. They moved with obscene calm through the firefight, saws whining, injector arrays twitching, servo limbs clacking over the wounded and the dead. They drove diseased stims into plague marines, whose bodies had been opened by bolter fire. They stitched severed limbs back onto warriors, who continued firing while the work was done. They cut organs from fallen loyalists when the Carcharodons failed to burn them quickly enough, dropping the trophies into glass jars that screamed and fogged from within. From the vat pits came the experiments. Vat-born monstrosities pulled themselves free from green fluid, huge and pale and unfinished. Some had too many arms and no heads. Some wore the fused armor of several men grown into one frame. Some crawled on spines extended into legs, dragging chains of feeding tubes behind them. One opened a vertical mouth along its torso and expelled a spray of teeth into a Carcharodon squad, the teeth punching through armor joints and burrowing inward like insects. The Carcharodons adapted. They did not follow the factory corridors once the Death Guard made slaughter tunnels of them. They cut new paths. Chain fists screamed through walls. Melter bombs opened pressure chambers and turned entire rooms into white-hot collapse. Rad scrubbers were carried by tech marines and surf teams until the serfs died beside them, after which space marines took the devices and kept advancing. Dreadnoughts drove through bulkheads rather than gates, shattering rusted machinery and crushing cultist crews beneath their tread. One ancient dreadnought named Kordrath broke a defensive line by walking through a wall of alchemical brick and screaming metal. Plague marines had prepared a corridor beyond, with intersecting plague spewers and blight launchers. Kordrath denied the corridor. He entered through the side of their position, heavy flamer washing the defenders at point-blank range. A plague spewer struck his sarcophagus and turned the outer plates green-black. He answered by seizing the weapon-bearer in his fist and grinding the plague marine against the wall until armor, bone, and organs became a smear. The Death Guard did not retreat. They fought from behind vats of infected fluid, firing over railings, from maintenance galleries, from under pipes, from behind racks of twitching bodies. Their plague bolters cracked with steady contempt. Blight launcher shells turned narrow passages into sudden abattoirs. Plague spewers filled stairwells from floor to ceiling, and even space marines drowned inside their own helmets when the filth found a breach. One Carcharodon clawed at his gorget as his helm filled with black fluid. His brother held him still and fired a bolt round through the visor before the plague could make use of what remained. Apothecary Harrock moved where the dead were thickest. He had served the chapter for centuries, and his armor was marked with the pale sigils of gene seed recovery and execution mercy. His narthecium clicked and hissed at his wrist. His reductor blade was bright despite the filth. Around him, war became anatomy. He knelt beside Brother Talon, whose chest had been torn open by a blight launcher. The warrior's twin hearts pulsed in ruined armor, one ruptured, one still hammering. His helm had split. His teeth were clenched so hard that several had broken. "Status," Harrock said. "Functional enough to die after recovery," Talon rasped. "Agreed." The reductor entered. Bone parted. Sacred organs were cut free with speed that bordered on violence. Talon watched the procedure through one remaining lens. "Both?" he asked. "One pure, one suspect." "Destroy suspect." "Already done." Talon exhaled. "Void, receive me." Harrock placed the muzzle of his bolt pistol under the warrior's jaw and fired. He was already moving before the body settled. A second brother staggered toward him from a side corridor, one hand pressed to his abdomen. His armor integrity rune flickered amber, then red. Behind the damaged plate, something moved under the skin with the rhythm of a worm seeking fruit. "Apothecary," the warrior said. Harrock scanned him once. The infection had reached too deep. It had learned the route. It moved toward the progenoids with obscene intelligence. "Unrecoverable," Harrock said. The brother lowered his head. "For the chapter." "For the chapter." Harrock killed him, opened him, and found one gene seed gland already black with tiny mouths. He burned both rather than risk uncertainty. That hurt more than the killing. Not emotionally. The Carcharodons did not spend themselves in such indulgence. It hurt as loss, as account, as bloodline denied continuation. Around him, the factory thundered. The first pylon fell to the Devourers. They reached it by scaling a series of exhaust stacks above a vat ocean where faces floated like curdled foam. Their jump packs were failing, turbines clogged with spores and grease. Half the squad had lost vox clarity. One had a plague knife lodged between his ribs and refused extraction. They carried melter charges in sealed clamps and placed them along the pylon's lower reinforcement rings, while cultist hordes climbed after them. Plague marines fired from gantries above. Poxwalkers crawled up the stacks beneath. A foul blight spawn reached the lower platform and bathed the entire level in chemical rot. The Devourer sergeant saw the pylon's internal pressure spike and understood there would be no withdrawal. "Charges armed," he voxed. "Withdraw if able," came Akuru's response. The sergeant looked at the enemy closing in, at the ruptured armor of his brothers, at the pylon pulsing with the light of the Barbaran crown. Unable. He detonated the charges by hand. The first pylon split from base to crown. Green lightning convulsed through it. The Devourers vanished inside the blast radius, their bodies atomized or hurled burning into the vat ocean below. The pylon leaned slowly, almost gracefully, then collapsed across the factory quarter, crushing cages, pipes, gun nests, and thousands of screaming laborers beneath its fall. Shield energy above the complex flickered. The second pylon died by Cordrath. The dreadnought fought his way into a reactor chamber below it, smashing through 3 defensive walls and walking through a storm of plague bolter fire. His chassis was open in 5 places. The warrior within his sarcophagus was exposed to poison, his flesh a blackened relic suspended in failing fluids. Still, he reached the reactor heart. A tech marine voxed him the overload sequence. Cordrath listened. "Insufficient time," the tech marine said. Manual lock required from within the chamber. I am within the chamber. Escape probability is void. I have been dead since interment. He sealed the blast doors from the inside. Plague Marines arrived too late. They hammered on the chamber locks. Kordrath braced himself against the reactor core, drove his power fist into the heart of the machine, and detonated his own sarcophagus charges at the moment of overload. The second pylon did not fall. It screamed. Its upper third burst outward in rings of diseased light. The reactor chamber became a sun beneath the factory floor. Everything within 100 paces turned white, then black, then nothing. The pylon's shield feed died with a howl that made every plague bell in the quarter answer. Only the third remained. Tyberos went to it himself. The route was cut through a cathedral of vats, where the ceiling vanished into smoke and chains descended farther than sight. Red brethren moved with him, though fewer than before. Akuru followed. Harok followed, his narthecium heavy with recovered gene seed and his execution tally still climbing. The third pylon rose ahead from a pool of thick black fluid, surrounded by shield engines and corpse-bound generators. Its light beat like a heart. A Death Guard warlord waited at its base. He was not a demon prince, not a Primarch's shadow. He was worse in another way, because he had once been a legionary and had chosen to remain a servant of decay for 10,000 years without needing wings or a throne. His armor was swollen Terminator plate, marked with the sigils of the 14th Legion and the 3 circles of Nurgle. His helm was open, revealing a face like cured meat stretched over bone, one eye milky, the other alive with patient malice. A man-reaper rested in his hands, its blade wet with condensation that smoked where it dripped. "Tyberos," the warlord said, "the Red Wake, the quiet butcher. I expected you sooner." Tyberos did not answer. The warlord smiled, and a fly crawled from between his teeth. "You think the crown sits waiting in one vat, one engine, one chamber. You think a blade can solve what has already become breath." Hunger and Slake began to turn. The warlord raised one gauntlet. "Truth before slaughter, loyal corpse. The Barbaran crown has already begun gestating inside living hosts. Penal meat, bondsmen, serfs, auxiliaries, wounded brothers, perhaps those you sealed, perhaps those you saved. Every battlefield below has been seeded. Every exposed lung, every cracked seal, every drop of blood taken by the fog may carry a fragment of the formula. Break the pylons if you wish. You do not yet know where the crown is growing." For the first time in the factory, the Vox went still. Akuru looked to Harok. The apothecary's internal displays filled with quarantine warnings, exposure charts, mortal support rosters, gene seed transfer routes, Medici contact logs, and the names of every living asset brought through the lowlands. The warlord lowered his man-reaper into killing stance. "Grandfather is generous. Your cruelty only chose the vessels faster." Tyberos moved. The duel began in the shadow of the third pylon, but the truth had already done its work. As Hunger and Slake met the man-reaper in a scream of chain teeth and poisoned steel, Tyberos opened the command vox to the fleet, the ground force, the apothecaries, the surf masters, and every sealed support deck still answering. His voice was quiet. Total internal purge, all exposed mortal auxiliaries, all infected support crews, all compromised surf decks, all non-essential assets with battlefield contact. Execute and burn, no exceptions. Akuru heard the order pass outward like winter. In orbit, blast doors would close. In landing zones, serfs would be lined against armor hulls. In Medici bays, men who had survived hell would be shot before hell could bloom inside them. On wounded decks, loyal servants would die confused, pleading, cursing, praying, and still useful in death because they would not become the crown. Harok received the second order directly. "Apothecary," said Tyberos, receiving. "Review all recovered organs. Destroy uncertainty." Harok looked down at the gene seed canisters locked across his belt. Compliance. At the base of the pylon, The Death Guard warlord laughed. Tyberos drove forward through the laughter, claws shrieking, armor smoking beneath the plague light. His cruelty had not saved him from Mortarion's design, not fully, but it might yet be the only reason the invasion had not already become the Death Lord's victory. The third pylon died screaming beneath the disease factories, and the world answered. Tyberos tore the Death Guard warlord apart at the base of the shield engine, but the victory was too late to be clean. Hunger and Slake had taken the traitor's arms, opened his terminator plate, and split the corrupted body until organs, cables, and fat ropes of blackened intestine spilled down the pylon's root machinery. The warlord laughed, even after his lungs were hanging outside him. He laughed when Tyberos crushed his helm into the pylon casing. He laughed when Akuru put a bolt round through the exposed remains of his face. He stopped only when Apothecary Harrock burned the head to ash and sealed the ash inside a quarantine urn for later disposal into a star. The third shield pylon buckled, its upper spines bent inward. Green lightning crawled backward through its own veins. Chains snapped above it, releasing cages full of infected workers into the vat sea below. Their bodies struck the surface and burst like fruit, sending rings of diseased foam across the black fluid. The alchemical shield feeding the deeper roads flickered and thinned, opening for the first time a path beneath the outer ward of the Black Manse. For one breath, the Carcharodons had achieved what they came to do. Then, the Pale King descended. It began with the machines. Engines stalled across the factory levels and the mountain approaches. Land raiders locked in place, their reactor spirits choking on sudden rust. Thunderhawks circling through the toxic clouds dipped as turbines screamed and misfired. Servo loaders froze with shells in their claws. Rad scrubbers went silent. Auspex feeds dissolved into static shaped like flies. The remaining dreadnoughts staggered, their sarcophagus systems flooding with warnings that no tech marine could silence. Then the mortals broke. Those few exposed support crewmen, who had not yet been purged, fell to their knees and vomited blood into their rebreathers. Some drowned standing. Some clawed their masks away and revealed faces already yellowing, eyes swollen, lips pulling back from teeth as if invisible hooks had entered their mouths. In the landing zones, wounded serfs waiting under quarantine sheets sat upright as one, backs bending at impossible angles, hands lifted in worshipful agony toward the mountain, their burned lungs inflated, their dead tongues moved. "Grandfather," they whispered. The Carcharodons killed them before the second word could spread. Bolters cracked in the medici pits. Flamers washed the quarantine rows. Apothecaries cut throats already open with plague sores, burned bodies already trying to rise, and destroyed canisters whose integrity runes had turned uncertain. Harrock watched gene seed vessels flash amber across his display and made decisions with the speed of execution. Certainty was life. Doubt was plague. Doubt burned. In the lowlands, corpses sat up. In the broken keep, bodies buried beneath rubble began to sing through stone. In the corpse canal, the drowned reached toward the surface. In the disease factories, vat fluid began to boil, and every bubble that burst released the sound of an old man laughing softly in a room full of the dying. The fog obeyed. It rolled back from the mountain in vast curtains, not fleeing but parting. Through it came Mortarion, demon primarch of the Death Guard, the Death Lord, the Pale King, the Lord of Plague Hosts, and bitter son of a dead age. His wings spread through the storm, ragged and immense, shedding grave dust, flies, and flakes of corpse light. His armor was a moving fortress of rust, bone, toxin vents, and ancient treachery. The lantern glimmered at his side like a caged star made cruel. Silence hung in his hands, the great scythe patient and absolute. Where he passed, metal sweated. Where his shadow fell, wounds reopened. Where his breath moved, hope remembered it had always been an infection waiting to fail. The Death Guard felt him and advanced harder without command. No order rang across the Vox.
bellkeeper needed to sound the charge. Plague Marines who had been fighting from behind vats stepped out into the open and marched through bolter fire with renewed endurance. Blightlord.
Terminators pushed into kill zones as if the shells striking their armor were rain. Demon engines surged against their chains, tearing anchors from stone, wheels and claws, grinding through corpse mud toward the grey invaders. Poxwalker oceans turned as one body and began climbing, pouring uphill with their dead hands raised. The factory war became apocalypse. A Carcharodon kill team, holding a gantry above the ruined second pylon, saw the fog thicken around them into the outline of mountains. Not the mountains of the plague planet, but older shapes, pale and murderous, the memory of Barbaros forced into the air. Their armor filters shrieked, their lungs filled with phantom poison. They maintained formation. They fired downward into the rising dead. Mortarion watched them struggle. He did not hurry. That was his cruelty. He did not need to rage as lesser champions raged. He did not need to laugh with the fevered joy of cultists. He let his aura do what axes and shells could not. He let discipline become suffering. He let transhuman lungs burn. He let sealed armor become a coffin. He watched grey warriors hold their kill lanes while blood leaked from their helm seals and their organs blackened by degrees. He watched them refuse panic. He watched them die slowly enough to understand that endurance was not salvation. His voice crossed the field, low and heavy, and every vox channel carried it whether permitted or not. You mimic suffering as children mimic war. The words entered armor, trenches, command nodes, and the broken teeth of the mountain. You wear exile like a virtue. You think silence makes you deep. You have never breathed Barbaros. You have never learned the patience of poison from the first gasp of life. Akuru heard the words while bracing his squad behind a ruptured vat. He felt his heart stutter as the air thickened. The brothers beside him fired through plague vapor into advancing plague marines. Bolt impacts burst across diseased plate. The enemy kept coming. One Carcharodon's helm flooded with blood from within. He stayed standing long enough to reload. Then a plague bolt struck his throat seal and removed his head in a burst of red mist and black vapor. Mortarion raised one hand. The rotwind came. It moved through the factory, a psychic plague force, a storm with purpose, a hurricane of filth and despair. It shredded gantries, stripped paint from armor, pulled breath from lungs, and drove invisible knives through exposed souls. Mortal bodies burst. Poxwalkers caught within it bloomed into clouds of flies and reformed crawling. Carcharodon formations staggered as their armor seals screamed. One entire strike group near the lower vats was lifted from the floor, turned slowly in the air, and crushed inward as if by the pressure of a deep ocean. Their plate split. Blood sprayed from joints. Their bodies fell in pieces, and the pieces twitched. The lantern fired. A beam of pale killing light crossed the chamber and found a Red Brethren officer directing fire from a broken shrine platform. The warrior's ancient Terminator plate, thick enough to survive boarding wars and demon claws, vanished around him. For a heartbeat, he existed as a black skeleton outlined in white fire. Then the skeleton collapsed into ash inside armor that no longer had a wearer. Silence followed. Mortarion entered melee at last, and the difference between war and murder became clear. The great scythe swept through the first Carcharodon line with effortless contempt. 3 warriors came apart in the same cut, torsos severed, armor opened, organs thrown across the factory floor in steaming ropes. A 4th raised a storm shield, and silence passed through the shield, through the arm, through the chest, and out the other side. The warrior fell in 2 halves, still trying to bring his chainsword around. A dreadnought charged him. The ancient warrior's name was carved in white across his sarcophagus, though the grime and plague had almost taken it. His assault cannon spun and roared, pouring fire into the demon Primarch's chest. Mortarion walked through the storm of shells. The dreadnought swung a power fist, large enough to crush a tank. Mortarion caught the blow against the haft of silence, turned, and carved through the sarcophagus with a single descending stroke. The coffin split open. The ancient within was exposed, a shriveled, heroic corpse suspended in fluids that turned black as the Primarch's aura touched them. Mortarion leaned close enough that the dreadnaught's dying sensors caught the shape of his rebreather. "Rest," the Death Lord said. Then he crushed the sarcophagus with one hand and moved on. Tyberos saw the field clearly. A straight duel was unwinnable. The fact did not shame him. It did not anger him. It became part of the plan the moment it was recognized. Mortarion was not a warlord to be overpowered by brutality. He was a Primarch, demon-raised and plague-enthroned, a walking catastrophe wearing the memory of betrayal as armor. To meet him as equal was fantasy. To kill him here was not the assigned objective. To delay him was possible. To occupy him long enough for the final strike to enter the Black Manse was necessary. Tyberos opened the command channel. Objective revision. Death Lord engagement is containment. Final strike elements proceed to ward breach. All elite reserves commit by sequence. There was no protest. The Carcharodons fed their finest into Mortarion's path. The Red Brethren struck first, teleporting in around him in a ring of crimson displacement. Storm bolters opened at once. Chain fists and lightning claws came alive. They did not expect to kill him. Their attack patterns targeted movement, line of sight, and weapon arcs. One drove a chain fist into Mortarion's wing joint and was rewarded with a backhand that broke his entire upper body inside his armor. Another managed to score Silence's haft with lightning claws before the scythe reversed and took him apart from groin to helm. A third clamped both fists around Mortarion's leg and detonated melter charges locked to his own breastplate. The blast staggered the Primarch half a step. That half step bought 6 seconds. Devourers came next, descending through the ruined factory heights on failing jump packs. They hit like falling blades, chains wards and power axes aimed for wings, vents, cables, and exposed plague flesh. Mortarion's aura killed 2 before they reached him. They struck the ground as liquefying shapes in grey plate. The rest landed and cut. One blade bit deep into demonic meat. Black blood hissed across the teeth. Mortarion looked at the wound, almost with curiosity, then swept Silence in a wide arc and turned the squad into a rain of limbs, armor plates, and blood. That bought 9 seconds. Veteran strike leaders advanced through the filth, firing combi melters, plasma, and sanctified bolter rounds. They died in disciplined order. One had his chest hollowed by the lantern. One was caught by rotwind and torn inside out through the joints of his armor, his organs pulled from him in red streamers that wrapped around a plague pipe. One reached Mortarion's flank and drove a thunderhammer into the Primarch's knee with enough force to crack the stone under both of them. Mortarion paused. He looked down at the warrior. The Carcharodon looked back through a cracked helm and tried to swing again. Mortarion placed Silence against his shoulder and pressed, slowly, deliberately. The blade descended through pauldron, collar, ribs, lungs, hearts, and hip. The warrior did not scream. His body split around the scythe and fell away in 2 wet halves. Mortarion turned his gaze toward Tyberos then. The Death Lord seemed amused, not pleased, not impressed in any generous sense. Amused as a jailer might be amused by a prisoner who chooses which hand to sacrifice before the blade falls. "You spend your sons like coin," Mortarion said. Tyberos stood amid the collapsing light of the ruined pylon, hunger and slake low at his sides. They were minted for war. For a moment, the factory listened. Even the bells seemed to hold their tongues. Then Mortarion laughed, and the laugh was a grave opening beneath a battlefield. So was I. He turned his gaze from Tyberos and found the Carcharodon command node. It had been hidden behind a shielded manufactorum bulkhead, protected by void-hardened plates, rad scrubbers, and overlapping kill teams. It coordinated teleport beacons, strike sequencing, orbital corrections, and the final route into the Black Mance's lower ward. It had survived plague fire, demon interference, and poxwalker breach attempts. Mortarion lifted the lantern. The beam pierced the factory wall, the shield plates, the command altar, and every warrior inside. The node did not explode. It ruptured. Carcharodons within burst as their armor became pressure vessels for plague force. Their bodies swelled, split, and opened, releasing clouds of flies that had not been inside them a heartbeat before. Serfs were reduced to red smears across cogitator banks. A tech marine fused to his console, his flesh boiling around the plugs, his last Binharic curse turning into wet static. Command runes died across the network in a wave of black. But the node's death had been anticipated. Its destruction completed the hidden rite. Beneath the Black Mance's outer ward, teleport beacons activated. They had been placed earlier by scouts who had never returned, carried in by servitors whose memories had been erased, and buried in the wake of collapsing pylons. They woke now under the cover of the command node's annihilation, masked by the burst of death and static Mortarion himself had created. Harrock saw the beacon flare across his display. Akuru saw it too. Tyberos saw all of it. Far above, in the Carcharodon fleet, teleportariums cycled beyond safety limits. Runes turned red. Machine spirits growled. Tech marines chanted rites of impossible translation, while plague interference clawed at the equations. Far below, beneath the warded mountain, final strike teams stood in crimson light with weapons ready, knowing that a rival might scatter them into walls, vats, demon stomachs, or the forbidden heart of the fortress world. Mortarion's wings spread wider. He understood a fraction too late. The Death Lord turned back toward Tyberos, and the amusement curdled into something older and colder. "Little predator," he said, "you would bare your throat to reach my house." Tyberos stepped into his path. Hunger and Slake awakened fully, their chain teeth roaring at last, their lightning fields snapping through the plague fog. Around him, the remaining Carcharodons repositioned not to win, not to live, but to force Mortarion's attention onto the red wake for as long as blood and bone could purchase. Tyberos said nothing. He did not need to. Above the plague planet, ships bled into the storm, and teleport chambers burned. Below the mountain, crimson light tore open forbidden space. The final strike teams translated into the heart of Mortarion's world, while Tyberos advanced toward the Pale King. Tyberos did not charge the Pale King as a lesser warrior might have done. There was no bellow of defiance, no oath hurled into the poisoned air, no declaration of vengeance, no invocation of glory, no promise that the Emperor's wrath had finally found its mark. Such things belonged to men who needed sound to cross the distance between life and death. The Red Wake advanced in silence. Mortarion waited for him amid the wreckage of the disease factory, wings spread beneath the vaulted dark, the ruin of the third pylon pulsing behind him like a dying heart. Around them, the battlefield had become a slaughter floor, layered with broken gantries, ruptured vats, corpse chains, melted armor, and the steaming remains of warriors who had already purchased seconds with their lives. Plague mist crawled low across the ground. It coiled around Tyberos's boots. It licked the joints of his armor. It searched for weakness with the patience of a god that had never needed to hurry. Mortarion watched him come. "Still silent," the Death Lord said. His voice was deep, bitter, and calm, carried through vox channels, cracked helms, dead mouths, and the wet breath of the factory itself. The void teaches little else, it seems. Tyberos did not answer. He struck at the first opening. Hunger and Slake came alive in a storm of chain teeth and lightning. He did not aim for Mortarion's heart. He did not seek the head, the throat, or the grand killing blow sung of by fools. Tyberos fought as an executioner who understood impossible anatomy. He cut for the joints of the armor, for tendon mass behind the knee, for the meat beneath the wing root, for the gauntlet grip upon silence, for cables, vents, corrupted plate seams, and exposed demonic tissue where ceramite and flesh had become one long blasphemy. Hunger bit into Mortarion's thigh. The weapon carved deep, chewing through armor, rust, swollen flesh, and something beneath that was neither muscle nor spirit, but a fusion of both. Black blood sprayed across Tyberos' chestplate, hissing where it touched the grey ceramite. Slake followed at the wing root, tearing a ragged trench through leathery membrane and pale gristle. Mortarion looked down at the wounds, as if inspecting scratches left by an animal. The rents bubbled, the black blood thickened, rotten tissue swelled outward, knitting itself across the damage in cords of mucus, grave mold, and twitching fibre. Flies emerged from the cut, crawled over the injury, and vanished back into flesh that had already begun to close. Then silence moved. The scythe did not swing like a weapon. It passed through the air like judgment given shape. Tyberos threw himself back, mag boots tearing stone from the floor as the blade carved the space his torso had occupied. The sweep struck a broken pylon buttress behind him and split it from crown to foundation. The shock of impact cracked the factory deck in a spreading web. 3 Carcharodons standing too near were hurled from their feet by the force alone. One struck a vat support hard enough to burst his spine. Another's helm shattered inward from pressure. The third tried to rise and found that the shockwave had pulped his organs inside undamaged plate. Mortarion advanced. His first blows held contempt rather than urgency. Silence came in wide arcs, each one forcing Tyberos to yield ground or be divided. The great scythe cut through iron pillars, corpse chains, vat casings, wrecked armor, and living warriors with equal ease. The air screamed where it passed. Every impact carried plague force, psychic weight, and the strength of a Primarch who had murdered armies before the Imperium had become the corpse empire it was now. Tyberos gave ground by inches, never in panic. He ducked beneath one cut and drove Slake into Mortarion's wrist joint, trying to disrupt the grip on silence. Chain teeth tore through cables and corrupted flesh. Mortarion's gauntlet flexed. Tyberos twisted the claw to widen the wound. The Death Lord brought his knee up and struck him in the chest. The blow lifted Tyberos from the ground. His Terminator plate crashed through a rack of iron cages and into a vat wall, denting it inward. Something inside the vat shrieked and burst against the glass. Tyberos dropped into ankle-deep sludge, armor-warning runes flaring across his vision. Chestplate integrity reduced, rib lattice damage, inner seals compromised, plague contact active. He rose. No curse passed his vox, no growl, no breath of pain. He advanced again. The Death Guard watched from the factory approaches in grim silence. Blight Lords, Plague Marines, Plague Surgeons, Bellbearers, and rotting cult commanders stood among the smoke and vapor, their weapons lowered or held at rest. They did not cheer for their Primarch. They did not need to. The presence of Mortarion was not a spectacle to them. It was inevitability made visible. The Carcharodons did not cheer either. They formed broken rings around the duel, firing only when ordered, moving only when their deaths would purchase value. The duel was not glory. It was not honor. It was ritualized extinction. Every warrior present understood that the Red Wake was not proving himself equal to the Death Lord. He was becoming a barricade made of one body, and the barricade would last only so long as bone, armor, and will could remain in the path of a god. Tyberos entered again at Mortarion's flank. He used a fallen Blightlord corpse as elevation, stepping upon the bloated armor and driving upward at the damaged wing root. Hunger tore into the previous wound before it fully closed. Slake crossed low, striking at the back of the knee. Mortarion shifted, not fast in the way a mortal duelist was fast, but with the inevitability of a mountain deciding where to fall. Silence's haft slammed into Tyberos' side. Something cracked within the Red Wake's armor. He kept the claws locked. For the first time, Mortarion exerted effort enough to show irritation. One vast hand seized Tyberos by the shoulder assembly and drove him down into the floor. The deck split beneath them. Tyberos's left pauldron buckled. Ceramite plating sheared away, exposing sublayers of adamantium reinforcement and thick cables beneath. Plague condensation rolled into the opening immediately, greedy and alive. Mortarion leaned over him. "You endure," he said. "So did the mountains of my birth. They too were ground down." Tyberos drove hunger into Mortarion's forearm. The chain teeth bit deep. Black blood lashed across his helm lenses. Mortarion lifted him one-handed and hurled him across the factory floor. Tyberos struck a corpse pile, went through it, and carved a furrow through bodies, armor fragments, and plague slime before his claws caught the ground and stopped him. The bodies beneath him moved. Not all were dead. Not all were loyal. Not all were still men. Hands clawed at his armor. Mouths opened in split faces. A half-poxwalker thing chewed at the exposed wiring beneath his damaged pauldron. Tyberos crushed it against the floor without looking, and rose again. His armor plating hung open across one side. Acid ate at the exposed inner layers. Warning runes became a red storm. The plague had found blood beneath the plate, not enough to own him, but enough to begin its work. His transhuman organs fought it. His armor fought it. His will gave the infection no audience. He advanced. Mortarion did not finish him. That was the next cruelty. The Death Lord could have pressed the attack. He could have brought silence down and split the red wake where he stood. Instead, he turned away for a breath and swept the scythe through a Carcharodon squad, moving to reposition along the shattered left flank. The blade caught them at varying heights. One lost both legs and his lower torso, collapsing into his own spilled organs. Another was severed through the chest, his upper body thrown spinning into a vat of infected fluid. A third raised a power fist, and silence took the arm, shoulder, and head in a single motion. Mortarion looked back at Tyberos as the bodies fell. "Does it speak beneath your helm?" he asked. "The little grief you bury beneath doctrine?" Tyberos continued forward. Mortarion moved again, not toward him, but toward another group of warriors holding a beacon relay beneath a collapsed gantry. The Carcharodons fired as he approached. Bolter rounds detonated against his armor. Plasma struck and ran across rusted plate in blue-white flares. A meltagun burned a black scar along his ribs. Mortarion answered with rotwind. The squad convulsed as psychic plague tore through them. Their armor swelled. Their helms filled. Their bodies burst outward at the joints, releasing clouds of flies from organs that had been whole moments before. Tyberos saw it. He made no sound. Mortarion watched him watching. "Still nothing," the Pale King said. "Are you disciplined, little predator, or only emptiness taught to wear armor?" Tyberos lifted one claw. Across the corpse piles, hidden runes woke. The trap had been prepared before Mortarion descended. The dead had not lain where they fell by chance. Carcharodon serfs, scouts, wounded brothers, and dying tech marines had seeded the battlefield beneath layers of bodies and wreckage as the duel unfolded. Teleport homers had been buried inside corpses. Melter charges had been pressed beneath plague-swollen flesh and ceramite fragments. Hexagrammic ward stakes, crude and unstable, had been driven into the factory floor under cover of smoke. Orbital lance coordinates had been calculated through the collapsing shield gaps and adjusted by warriors who knew the first firing solution might kill them too. Tyberos closed his fist. The corpse piles ignited. Melter charges bloomed in a ring around Mortarion, white heat tearing through bodies, armor, slime, and rusted metal. Teleport homers flared, not to translate warriors in or out, but to anchor a pattern of impossible geometry in the space around the Primarch. Ward stakes cracked and shone with ugly, desperate light. Above the plague planet, through poison storm and demon interference, the Carcharodon fleet fired. Orbital lances pierced the clouds. The beams struck in sequence around Mortarion, not upon him alone.
but around the circle the hidden devices had formed. Light became a cage, stone vaporized, vats exploded outward, spilling oceans of diseased fluid that turned to steam before reaching the ground. Plague Marines too close to the ring were burned down to blackened skeletons inside their armor. Carcharodons at the perimeter died as well, their plate flashing white, bodies reduced to silhouettes and ash. Mortarion stood within the collapsing ward circle, wings spread, silence raised. For a heartbeat, he was pinned, not bound in defeat, not helpless, never that, pinned. The lance light struck his armor and burned trenches across the rusted plates. Melter fire tore at his wings. The unstable ward geometry forced his manifestation inward, compressing the rot aura, turning its pressure.
Back upon him. His flesh split in several places. Black blood fell in heavy drops, each one hissing craters into the stone. A wound opened across his side, deeper than the others, exposing pale demonic tissue beneath the armor. Mortarion roared. The sound was not rage alone. It was insulted antiquity. It was a mountain of graves shaking off the hands of insects. The factory trembled. Chains snapped in the heights. Vats burst. Men died from the pressure of the sound, their hearts rupturing inside their chests. Several Carcharodons at the outer ring collapsed at once, armor intact. Organs turned black by the intensified aura, now beating outward in waves. Tyberos entered the ring. The heat stripped more plating from his armor. The plague pressure struck him like an ocean collapsing. His exposed side smoked. Blood ran inside his suit. Hunger and Slake snarled as they passed through the ward light. He moved with brutal economy, stepping through fire and rot, closing the distance while Mortarion fought the trap's geometry. Mortarion saw him. The pale king's eyes burned behind the rebreather. "You cannot kill death." Tyberos came on. "No," he said, "but I can make it bleed." He struck the open wound at Mortarion's side. Both claws drove in, chain teeth screaming into demonic flesh. The black blood came harder this time, spraying across Tyberos's helm, chest, and exposed shoulder in boiling sheets. Mortarion's fist crashed down onto his back, breaking armor ridges and driving him to one knee. Tyberos kept the claws buried. He twisted them outward, ripping a wider rent before the flesh could close. Silence descended. Tyberos tore free and turned just enough that the scythe did not split him from crown to groin. It still struck him. The blade sheared through the remains of his damaged pauldron, through outer plating, through flesh beneath, and out in a spray of blood and sparks. The blow hurled him across the ward circle. He hit the ground hard enough to crater it, hunger scraping a line through stone as he forced himself to stop. Mortarion tore the trap apart. His wings beat once, scattering lance fire into refracted plague light. Silence swept through two ward stakes, shattering their geometry. His aura intensified. The remaining teleport homers burst one by one, each detonation taking nearby corpses and wounded warriors with them. The melter fires guttered under a wave of green rot. The orbital lances lost coherence as the plague planet's storms surged back over the firing window. The ward circle collapsed. Mortarion stepped out of it wounded, smoking, enraged, and very much undefeated. The injury Tyberos had opened bubbled and tried to heal. It did not close as quickly now. Black blood ran from it in thick streams. Flies gathered around the wound and died in the heat of whatever energies still clung there. Mortarion looked down at the damage, then at Tyberos, who was rising again from the broken floor. For the first time, something like respect touched the Death Lord's contempt. It made him more terrible. Around them, the Carcharodons began dying inside their armor. The intensified aura rolled across the chamber in dense waves. Brother after brother stiffened as organs blackened in their chests. Some fell without sound. Some vomited blood through their helm vents. Some remained upright, bolters locked in dead hands, until poxwalkers dragged them down. Apothecary Harrock moved among those he could reach, killing the corrupted, cutting the pure, burning the doubtful. He worked faster than thought, and still fell behind the death.
Akuru held a shattered pillar with the last of his squad, firing into Death Guard warriors attempting to close around Tyberos. He saw the red wake rise again and understood that no flesh, not even transhuman flesh, should still be able to move under such ruin. Yet Tyberos moved, not because he could win, because the strike team still needed time. Far below the broken battle, beneath wards that had thinned for one stolen interval, crimson translation light spat warriors into forbidden dark. The Black Man's strike team arrived inside a vault approach, lined with bone, parchment, and breathing iron. Some materialized whole, some arrived embedded in walls and died before they could scream. One red brother emerged missing an arm and continued forward without comment. A chaplain struck his Crozius against the floor and began a kill litany through a
Vox channel thick with whispers. They fought through the first chamber with bolters, claws, and chain fists, killing Vat Guardians and Plague Scribes before the defenders understood the breach had occurred. Ahead of them, great doors opened not by mechanism, but because the thing beyond wanted witnesses. The vaults of the Barbaran crown waited. The weapon was not housed in a single engine. It was alive in part, grown across vats filled with host bodies whose swollen skulls were fused into crown-like arrangements. It was written in part, crawling across scrolls of flayed skin, brass plates, bone tablets, and plague script that rearranged itself when looked upon. It was screaming in part, though not from one mouth. The sound came from every host, every pipe, every page, every drop of fluid beating through the vault's veins. A red Brethren warrior raised his stormbolter. The chaplain caught his arm. "Not yet," he said. "We must know where to cut." Behind them, far above them, Tyberos faced Mortarion again, in the dying light of the trap. In the vault, the Barbaran crown screamed louder, as if it knew the blade had finally reached the nerve. The Black Manse was not a fortress that had been built. It was a disease that had learned architecture. The strike team entered through a vault artery beneath the mountain, translated by unstable teleport geometry into a chamber whose walls flexed with the rhythm of breathing organs. The stone was black, but beneath it, something pale moved, pressing outward in slow pulses, as if the mountain itself had lungs. Pipes ran overhead like exposed veins. Chains hung from the darkness, each one bearing plague bells, corpse cages, rusted censer bowls, or test subjects stitched into devotional shapes. Some of the bodies still lived. Some had lived for centuries. Their eyes followed the Carcharodons as they emerged from crimson light and reassembled in the sacred rot of Mortarion's house. Not all arrived whole. One Red Brethren Terminator materialized halfway through a wall of bone iron. The teleport flare ended with his lower body fused into the structure, armor, flesh, and stone occupying the same space. He did not scream. His helm turned once toward the chaplain. The chaplain raised his Crozius and struck the warrior's head from his shoulders before the wall could finish growing through him. The body remained upright, welded into the Black Manse as another nameless offering. Another warrior arrived without his left arm. The limb had been taken by the warp or buried in some sealed chamber beyond reach. Blood pumped from the severed stump in disciplined pulses before his armor clamped down and cauterized. He checked his stormbolter with his remaining hand and joined the line. The chaplain stood at the center of the breach, skull helm wet with condensation, Crozius held low. Beside him came Apothecary Harrock, Narthesium raised, gene seed canisters locked against his armor like pale relics. A tech marine named Orath moved behind them, servo arms twitching, mechadendrites tasting the air and recoiling from the filth of the place. The last among them was the pale nomad, librarian Sahul, robed in tattered void grey, over power armor marked with ward script, shark-tooth charms, and old exile signs. His hood was sealed. Frost formed along the edges of his force staff, despite the fever heat of the chamber. He was the only reason the route remained open. The warp pressure beneath the Black Manse was immense.
It pushed at their souls with the weight of poisoned mountains. It whispered in dead brothers' voices. It tugged at memories of the void, of hunger, of exile, of old debts never spoken aloud. Sahul planted his staff against the floor. Pale light crawled from its head in a thin ring, not bright enough to cleanse, only stubborn enough to deny immediate possession. Root integrity failing, he voxed. "Hold it," said the chaplain. "I am holding what should not be held." "Then continue." They advanced. The black manse opened around them in layers of decay. Laboratories stretched beyond grated windows, filled with glass cylinders of plague fluid and bodies suspended in alchemical frames. Plague surgeons bent over tables where prisoners had been dismantled and reassembled into maps of infection. In one chamber, a man's nervous system had been removed and spread across brass hooks, while the mouth remained alive in a jar, reciting numbers that
changed into prayers. In another, children of vat and corpse were grown together into swollen hosts, whose skulls bore the early shape of crowns. The Carcharodons burned what they could without slowing. Dungeons lined the lower passageways. Hands reached through bars. Some wore imperial shackles. Some wore the rusted chain brands of Mortarion slave cults. Some were not hands, but still remembered the gesture. Harrock marked them all infected. The Red Brethren put bolt shells through faces pressed against the grates. Orath released radwashes into crowded cells until the screams became coughing and the coughing became wet silence. Beyond the dungeons lay libraries. They were worse. The mouldering archives of the Black Manse rose in towers of skin-bound books, bone tablets, rusted data looms, and hanging scrolls written in fluids that refreshed themselves as they dried. Words crawled across pages when unobserved. Servo skulls with plague-swollen eyes drifted between shelves, whispering index codes and autopsy hymns. Brass cages held demons shaped like scribes, their fingers too long, their mouths sewn shut with living wire. The Barbaran crown lived here in script as much as flesh. The cipher that would allow it to be remade had to be stolen or burned. The mission had 3 blades: destroy the physical vats, burn or seize the cipher script, collapse the shield network, feeding the distribution engines. The chaplain marked each objective with the blunt certainty of execution. No warrior asked how many would survive the completion. The question had been answered when they translated in. The first death shroud struck before the vault doors were reached. It came from an archway that had been empty a breath before, scythe already moving. The blade took the head from the one-armed Red Brother and continued through the shoulder of the warrior behind him. The severed helm spun into a shelf of plague books, cracking lenses against old bone bindings. The decapitated body remained standing, Stormbolter firing from instinct, until the Death Shroud's return stroke opened it from sternum to spine. The corridor compressed into murder. More Death Shroud emerged from the darkness, silent and swollen, scythes held in execution grips. Their armor exhaled plague vapor through cracked vents. They moved with impossible speed for things so massive. The Red Brethren met them shoulder to shoulder. Chain fists screamed, power claws sparked, storm bolters fired at point-blank range, shells detonating against corrupted Terminator plate and showering the corridor with rust, pus, and armor fragments. A Death Shroud drove his scythe through a Red Brethren chest and pinned him to the floor. The Carcharodon locked both gauntlets around the haft and held it there, preventing the weapon's withdrawal. Another Red Brother stepped over him and drove a chain fist into the Death Shroud's helm. The teeth caught, jammed, then tore inward. The Plague Warrior's skull burst beneath the grinding blade, spraying black brain matter and white grubs across the wall. A second Death Shroud cut the chain fist bearer in half. There was no room to fall cleanly. Bodies stayed upright because other bodies held them there. Broken helms pressed against cracked breastplates. Blood ran into boot joints. Plague slime mixed with sacred oils. A power claw closed on a Death Shroud's throat and crushed until the helm collapsed.
only for the dying traitor to ram his scythe upward through the attacker's abdomen, lifting him from the floor as organs spilled down the haft in glistening ropes. No one cheered, no one cursed. The Carcharodons died silently in the sacred dark, spending themselves one obstruction at a time. Then the book spoke. It lay open on a lectern of vertebrae beyond the melee, a lesser plague tome bound in the hide of something that had once been a saint. Its pages turned without hands. The words upon them were not read by the eyes. They entered through blood, through old wounds, through doubt hidden beneath discipline. The voice inside them was gentle. It offered survival. It offered vengeance against those who had cast them into exile and forgotten the price they paid in the void. It offered the return of all lost brothers, not as poxwalkers, not as slaves, but as enduring warriors beyond hunger, beyond tithe, beyond decay's fear. It offered freedom from silence. A red brethren warrior staggered, his storm bolter lowered by a
fraction. Harrock's helm turned toward him. The chaplain's crozier struck the floor hard enough to crack the black stone. "Kill oaths," he commanded. Their voices rose through blood and broken vox grills. Not loudly, never loudly, but together. They recited the old words of the chapter, void, cold, and pitiless, each phrase a hook driven into the self. The tome pushed back. It spoke in the voice of dead serfs, dead brothers, dead aspirants taken in tithe and never named. It showed them the outer dark, the endless hunger, the forgotten wars, the debt that had made them what they were. It promised release. The chaplain walked to the lectern under scythe fire. A death shroud turned to stop him. Sahul raised his force staff, and pale witchlight wrapped around the traitor's limbs. The death shroud strained against it. The librarian's armor cracked at the joints from the backlash. Blood ran from his helm seals, freezing as it fell. The chaplain reached the tome and placed one gauntlet upon the living pages. The book screamed inside every skull. "Exile is not a wound," the chaplain said. "It is a weapon." He brought the crozius down. The lectern shattered. The book split open. Its pages became mouths. The chaplain burned them with a hand flamer until the mouths curled into ash, still whispering promises from the floor. Harrock saw the infection then, not in the air, not in the blood, deeper. The Barbaran crown had touched two of the strike team through the tome, through the vault pressure, through the idea of survival itself. Their vital signs remained pure. Their armor seals were intact. Their souls were not. Harrock's diagnostic runes showed impossible crown patterns forming across neural echoes and gene seed resonance. The plague did not need flesh first. It had learned to gestate in meaning. He stepped behind the first warrior and fired a bolt round through the back of his helm. The body dropped. The second turned, too fast, weapon rising. Harrock caught the bolter barrel with his narthecium arm, forced it aside, and fired through the warrior's throat seal. The head burst upward. Blood sheeted across the corridor. The red brethren nearest him did not look away from the death shroud pressing them. "Corruption vector?" asked the chaplain. "Metaphysical," Harrock said. "Recover?" "Attempting." He opened the bodies under fire. A plague scythe cut sparks from the wall above him. Bolt detonations shook the floor. Sahul groaned as warp pressure bent around the chamber. Harrock worked kneeling in blood, reductor blades punching through breastplate and throat, extracting progenoid organs that steamed in the foul air. One gland bore black veins. He crushed and burned it. The other was clean enough to risk sealing. From the second warrior, nothing could be saved. He burned both organs and marked the loss in silence. Ahead, Orath reached the vault engines. They were not machines in any sane sense. They were towers of brass, bone, intestine pipe, and demon-bound logic, feeding power from the shield network into the distribution organs of the Barbaran crown. Binary code crawled across them and became plague scripture halfway through each line. Pistons moved like ribs. Data cables pulsed with blood. A machine spirit was trapped within, still imperial at its root, screaming beneath demonic code that had been grown through it like mold through bread. Orath connected himself to the engine. Every warning rune on his armor flashed crimson. "Tech Marine," the chaplain voxed. "Silence," Orath answered. His voice split into Binharic, then into static, then into a harsh human rasp as he fought the machine from within its own desecrated logic. Servo arms locked around control rods. Mechadendrites plunged into ports that bit down and drew blood. Sacred Binharic collided with demon code. The vault lights flickered. The engine screamed, not in sound alone. It screamed through gravity, through vox, through the bones of the warriors nearby. "I can overload the network," Orath said. "I cannot cleanse it." "Cleansing was not ordered," said the chaplain. "The blast will wound this engine complex. It will not kill the world." "Wound is sufficient." The final death shroud fell beneath 4 red brethren and the librarian's failing witchlight. It took 2 of them with it. One Carcharodon had his helm crushed flat by the scythe haft. Another was opened from belly to chin, and his organs slid out across Harrock's boots. The apothecary killed him before the plague could take the exposed meat and marked the gene seed unrecoverable. The vault doors opened fully. The Barbaran crown screamed. It filled the chamber beyond in multiple forms at once. Physical vats held swollen host bodies fused skull to skull, their cranial bones grown into crown-like rings, their mouths stretched open around tubes that fed them plague formula and whispered doctrine. Script crawled across suspended skins and brass plates, changing shape as the warriors approached. Distribution engines pumped infectious data, fluid, prayer, and warp charge through pipes leading into the mountain, the battlefield, perhaps the fleet if given time. It was a plague, a weapon, a liturgy, and an idea trying to become geography. Harrock raised his flamer. The chaplain raised his crozius. Sahul raised his staff, though his hands shook and blood ran from beneath his hood. Then Tyberos's voice entered the channel. It was damaged by distance, plague interference, and the thunder of a battle that should already have killed him. "Status." The chaplain looked at the crown. "Vault breached, engines compromised, cipher present, strike team cannot guarantee extraction." A pause. Beyond the vox, something vast roared. "Mortarion." Tyberos answered. "Final detonation, now." No one questioned him. Orath drove his remaining mechadendrites deeper into the vault engine. The machine spirit screamed as he forced the overload through it. Sahul anchored the warp pressure long enough for the charges to receive the command. The chaplain began the final kill litany. The Red Brethren fired into the host vats. Harrock burned the cipher skins nearest him, watching the writing twist into faces as it died. The vault erupted. Melter charges opened the physical vats. Host bodies burst in chains, skull crowns splitting, brains and plague fluid spraying across the chamber before Prometheum took them. Radcores cracked and washed the script archives in invisible death. Orath overloaded the engine network, and the alchemical shields feeding the distribution organs reversed through their own conduits. Demonic gates slammed open and shut, cutting cult populations in half as space folded wrong. Laboratories above collapsed into the vaults. Dungeons became furnaces. Libraries burned with flames that screamed in 7 languages, and then in none. The Barbaran crown did not die like a creature. It failed like a prophecy being strangled before completion. Its scream crossed the fortress world. Poxwalkers froze mid-step. Plague surgeons dropped their instruments. Bells shattered in towers. Cultists clawed their ears until fingers entered brain. In the lowlands, corpse mud bubbled and spat black fire. In orbit, Carcharodon astropaths bled from sealed eyes. Across the mountain, the black manse convulsed, as if something beneath it had been stabbed through the heart. The strike team vanished inside white-green fire. No clean extraction rune appeared. No triumph code followed. Only detonation confirmation, broken by static and the fading echo of the chaplain's kill oath. Far above the ruined factories, Mortarion felt the wound. He stopped playing with Tyberos. The amusement left him. The measured cruelty vanished. The test was over. The Pale King turned his full attention upon the red wake, and the air around him blackened with wrath. Silence rose in both hands. His wings spread until the storm itself recoiled. The wound Tyberos had carved in him bled freely now, but the blood fell like burning judgment, and where it struck the ground, the stone remembered plague. Mortarion stepped forward. The factory floor cracked beneath him. "Enough," said the Death Lord. Then he unleashed his full wrath. Mortarion's wrath did not descend like a blow. It became the world. The factory floor split beneath him, stone and iron peeling back in jagged plates as the Pale King advanced through the dying light of the ruptured vaults. The wound Tyberos had carved into his side bled black and heavy, each drop striking the ground with the hiss of acid and the weight of curse fire. But the injury no longer slowed him. It clarified him. It stripped away the measured amusement, the patient cruelty, the willingness to test the silent butcher before him. Now the Death Lord came to end the interruption. Silence moved in both hands. Tyberos met the first stroke with hunger and slake crossed before him. The impact drove him backward across the broken floor, his boots tearing furrows through metal, bone, and slag. His armor shrieked under the force. Warning runes flooded his helm lenses, layer upon layer of crimson condemnation. Shoulder assembly failing, chestplate compromised, blood toxicity rising, internal contamination present, left arm response delayed, secondary heart strain critical. He ignored the warnings. Mortarion struck again. This time silence did not meet the claws cleanly. The scythe slid along Slake's energized teeth, sheared through an already ruined pauldron, and opened Tyberos from shoulder to ribs. The blade did not simply cut armor and flesh. It carried plague into the wound like a priest pressing sacrament into a mouth. Tyberos's blood blackened where the edge touched it. Flesh hissed. His armor's internal purifiers screamed and died. The red wake dropped to one knee. Mortarion stepped close enough that his shadow swallowed him. "No more lessons," the demon Primarch said. "No more seconds bought with dead suns. No more little knives in the dark." Tyberos drove hunger upward. The claw bit into Mortarion's forearm, tearing through a seam of armor and the swollen meat beneath. It was not enough. Mortarion caught Tyberos by the gorget with one hand and lifted him from the floor, as if Terminator plate and transhuman mass were nothing. The pressure of that grip cracked ceramite around the throat seals. Tyberos kicked once, driving a boot into Mortarion's wounded side. Black blood sprayed. The Pale King did not release him. Silence rose. For the first time since the war began, the Carcharodons moved not as attackers, but as a shield. The last Red Brethren hurled themselves into the space between their chapter master and the descending scythe. One had lost half his helm. One dragged a chain fist whose teeth no longer turned. One was already dying, his armor filled with plague fluids, held back only by his own failing seals. They struck Mortarion's arm, wing, weapon haft, anything that might alter the killing angle. Silence fell. The first Red Brother vanished from waist to crown, his armor parting around him in a burst of blood, bone, and shredded black undersuit. The second lost both arms and his head in the same sweep. The third managed to lock his chain fist around the scythe's haft before Mortarion crushed his torso with a contemptuous kick, pulping the warrior inside his plate. Yet their deaths had turned the blow by a fraction. The scythe missed Tyberos's throat. It took his chest instead. The blade carved across him in a terrible diagonal, smashing through outer armor, biting into ribs, scoring the reinforced organs beneath. Tyberos hit the ground hard enough to break stone. Hunger tore free from his gauntlet's weakened grip and skidded away through plague slime, still growling. Slake sparked and died against his other hand. His blood ran black-red across the floor. Mortarion raised silence for the final stroke. A dreadnought torso hit him from the side. It was not walking. It had no legs. Its sarcophagus was split and burning, its weapon arms torn away, its front plate peeled open to expose the half-dead ancient within. Yet the remains had been dragged by cable and grav hook through the smoke by surviving Carcharodons, then detonated forward with emergency thrusters and raw hatred. The ruin of the dreadnought slammed into Mortarion's knee and exploded in a blossom of reactor fire. The blast did not kill the Primarch. It did not even throw him down. It made him turn. That was enough. Teleport beacons flared around Tyberos in unstable crimson bursts. They could not take him cleanly. The plague planet's interference clawed at the translation pattern. Mortarion's aura gnawed at the coordinates. The Black Manse screamed through the signal. 3 Carcharodons reached their chapter master before the next sweep of silence. One lost his legs to a scythe stroke and crawled the remaining distance on his elbows, hooking a chain around Tyberos's armor. Another was split open by plague bolter fire from advancing Death Guard, but locked both gauntlets into Tyberos's damaged chest harness before dying. A third took up hunger and thrust it back into the Red Wake's hand. "Rise," the warrior voxed. Tyberos did not answer. He closed his gauntlet around hunger. The teleport flare swallowed them badly. One of the rescuing Carcharodons translated in pieces, his torso arriving aboard the extraction craft, while his lower body remained on the factory floor. Another materialized with his spine reversed and died without sound. Tyberos arrived whole enough to live, though the craft's deck blackened beneath the blood leaking from his armor. The retreat began. It was not heroic. No banners were raised over the broken keep. No victory hymn passed across the fleet. No warriors stood upon ridges and dared the foe to come. The Carcharodons withdrew by order, by vector, by sacrifice. Squads fell back through pre-marked kill corridors, while others stayed behind to collapse them. Devourers held gantries until their jump packs died and the dead climbed over them. Apothecaries killed those too corrupted to move and cut what gene seed could be cut. Tech Marines overloaded reactor shrines, ammunition stocks, and crippled armor to deny them to the enemy. Every withdrawal lane became a slaughterhouse. Plague-burst crawlers fired into extraction zones, their mortars lobbing diseased shells through the fog with patient precision. Each impact opened the ground and filled it with corrosive spores. Landing beacons vanished beneath clouds of yellow rot. Mortal support teams waiting for evacuation melted into puddles around crates of ammunition they had carried through hell. Carcharodon squads crossed the zones at a run, armor smoking, while shells burst among them and turned brothers into fragments of grey plate and red mist. Bloat drones hunted the Thunderhawks. They rose from the fog on whining rotors, bloated demon engines with plague spewers and flesh mower blades, their hulls grinning with iron mouths. They pursued through toxic cloud banks, spraying infection across wings and engine housings. One Thunderhawk climbed with its troop bay still open, Carcharodons firing from the ramp, while poxwalkers clung to the landing gear. A drone rammed it from beneath. The gunship rolled, struck a fortress chain, and broke apart in the air. Grey armored bodies fell through the clouds like stones, some still firing until the ground swallowed them. Blight haulers mauled the retreating armor columns along the Corpse Canal Road. Multi-melter beams lanced through rhinos and predators. Missile impacts flipped transports into the mire. A land raider, its hull already ruptured, reversed over a horde of poxwalkers to keep them from reaching an extraction ramp. A blight hauler struck it head-on, biting into the front plate with grinding jaws. The Land Raider's machine spirit held the line long enough for the warriors behind it to board their craft. Then its reactor went critical, and loyal tank and demon engine vanished together in white fire and plague steam. The Poxwalker seas climbed over everything. They filled trenches, they scaled ramps, they crawled across tank hulls and gunship skids. They came with teeth, fingers, broken nails, and ecstatic hunger. One extraction lander lifted with hundreds clinging to its underside, their bodies burning in the engine wash, their hands still gripping. Carcharodons at the ramp fired down into the press
until ammunition ran dry. Then they used blades, then fists, then their own bodies as barricades, until the ramps sealed on arms, heads, and screaming faces. Some craft rose infected. Tyberos lay braced in a restraint throne aboard the command lander, armor locked open by emergency clamps, while Harrock and 2 surviving serf chirurgeons fought the plague in his blood. The apothecary cut away blackened flesh without asking permission. Purifier needles punched into Tyberos's torso. Old blood and corrupted fluids drained across the deck into a burning sump. His helm remained sealed. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, despite the ruin of his body. Fleet quarantine status. Akuru, wounded and standing beside the command altar, with one arm hanging useless, answered. Multiple extraction craft contaminated. 2 carry confirmed Carcharodon survivors. 3 carry mortal support. 1 carries recovered gene seed, but has active plague signal in its hold. Destroy them before docking. Akuru did not pause. Compliance. In orbit, point defense batteries turned upon friendly craft. The first lander was cut apart by interceptor fire, its hull opening into flame before it reached the receiving bay. The second tried to transmit identity codes. The codes were correct. The contamination markers were also correct. A lance from the Nicor touched it, and the craft became a brief sun over the plague planet's cloud layer. The vessel carrying recovered gene seed was destroyed last. Its pilot, a Carcharodon with 1 functioning lung and plague growth across his armor seals, transmitted only 2 words before impact. For void. Then the fleet killed him. No corruption was permitted to return to the dark between stars. Below, Mortarion watched the evacuation. He could have pressed harder. His fleets could have closed more tightly. His mountain guns could have concentrated on the wounded strike cruisers. His death guard could have drowned every extraction zone in bodies until no grey warrior rose from the surface. The plague planet had not been conquered. Its master had not been defeated. The Death Lord still stood amid the ruin, wounded but vast, his scythe wet, his domain shuddering around the injury driven into its hidden organs. He allowed part of the fleet to escape. Not mercy, never mercy. He let them go because the wound they carried was useful. Let the Imperium hear of success that looked like annihilation. Let the Inquisition count the butcher's price and name it necessary. Let the Carcharodons remember that they had reached into the Black Manse and come away with claws broken, sons spent, and their lord nearly cut from history. Let every survivor carry the knowledge that Mortarion could be delayed, wounded, angered, but not slain by such knives. And let them understand that the Death Lord had learned them. As the Carcharodon ships withdrew through the orbital wreckage, they fired one final bombardment. They did not claim victory. They did not target the whole plague planet, for such arrogance belonged to fools. They targeted the broken disease factory region, the collapsed pylon network, the exposed vault arteries, the ruined distribution engines, and the roads by which the Barbaran crown's remains might be recovered quickly. Lance fire descended through the cloud gaps. Macro shells fell in burning processions. Cyclonic judgment was not spent. This was not exterminatus. This was mutilation. The disease factories burned again. Vats split. Laboratories collapsed. Slave populations already dying were turned to ash. Plague cults vanished beneath falling ceilings and white fire. The corpse roads became glass in places, and boiling pits in others. The buried vaults of the crown were hammered until their entrances became craters filled with molten rust. The weapon was ruined before completion, not destroyed beyond all memory, not cleansed from existence, but wounded deeply enough that Mortarion's design would require time, flesh, and hatred to rebuild. Time was the only victory the Imperium ever truly bought. The Carcharodons translated away under fire. They left behind wrecks, dead brothers, abandoned armor, scuttled craft, and the ash of millions. Plague ships pursued them through the outer reach, but not with the same hunger as before.
The Death Guard had made their point. The Carcharodons had made theirs. Between them lay a graveyard of iron and souls that would orbit the plague planet until rot made relics of it all. Aboard the Nicor, the cost was counted. Gene seed recovered, gene seed lost, gene seed burned under doubt, relics unrecovered, Red Brethren's strength reduced below acceptable thresholds, Devourer cadres mauled, Dreadnought sarcophagi lost beyond retrieval, surf decks purged, mortal auxiliaries erased, penal assets expended in full, ships scuttled, extraction craft destroyed by friendly fire, infected brothers executed, strategic objective damaged, primary target incomplete, Mortarion alive. Tyberos listened to the tally from within his armor. He had refused removal from the plate. The apothecaries had stabilized what could be stabilized and sealed what could not yet be repaired. His blood remained under watch. His wounds smoked beneath layers of antiseptic, sacred oil, and more brutal chemical restraints. Hunger rested beside him, damaged but alive. Slake remained locked to his other gauntlet, teeth dulled, spirit snarling. Inquisitor Malrek Voss came to him after the fleet cleared the first veil of the eye. The Inquisitor looked older than when he had summoned them. The black ship had survived, though its lower decks were under quarantine, and half its astropathic choir was dead again in ways that disturbed even those accustomed to sanctioned suffering. Voss stood before the red wake and studied the giant in ruined armor. The Barbaran crown was prevented, Voss said. Tyberos said nothing. The plague planet was wounded. Nothing. Mortarion himself bled. Still nothing. Voss's brass eye clicked and refocused. There will be those who call this impossible, those who call it a victory, those who will say the price was justified. Tyberos's helm turned by the smallest degree. Voss asked the question because some part of him needed to hear whether monsters ever measured anything beyond the cut. Was it worth the price? The red wake answered softly. The price was paid. Worth is irrelevant. Voss had no reply. Far behind them, beneath the corpse clouds of his fortress world, Mortarion walked through the ruins of the Black Mance's wounded depths. The laboratories were broken. Their tables had been split, their prisoners burned, their vats ruptured. Mouldering libraries smouldered in black piles, pages still crawling even as fire ate them. The vaults of the Barbaran crown were a shattered cathedral of flesh, script, and failed prophecy. Host bodies hung open. Cipher plates lay warped and slagged. Distribution engines twitched without rhythm. Death Guard adepts labored in silence among mountains of dead, gathering what fragments could be gathered, burning what had become unstable, bowing whenever the Pale King passed. Mortarion was not defeated. He was wounded. The distinction mattered. His side still bled where Tyberos had cut him. The wound closed slowly, resisting even the generosity of the plague god. Mortarion touched the injury with one clawed finger and looked at the black blood upon it. Around him, the Black Mance groaned. The mountain remembered pain. The fog beyond the broken walls shifted with his displeasure. He smiled without joy. The grey predator had reached farther than expected. It had cut a nerve, not the heart. It had ruined a work, not the will that conceived it. It had taught Mortarion nothing of fear, but something of appetite. The Imperium still bred monsters in its dark places, silent ones, useful ones, monsters willing to burn their own blood to delay the end by one more day. Very well, the next design would account for them. The Death Lord turned from the broken vault and began to speak new instructions to the surviving plague adepts. New hosts, new vectors, new routes through breath, memory, gene seed, and grief. Something worse would grow from the wound, because that was the truth of decay. Cut rot away, and it returned, knowing the shape of the knife. Beyond the eye's diseased light, the surviving Carcharodon fleet vanished back into the outer dark. No song followed them. No victory banner marked their passing. Only silence, old scars, and teeth.